say we don't realize the mess we're getting in. The mess we're getting in.
It's Britney, bitch.
And the Iraq everywhere like such as.
I'm supposed to be the franchise player, and we're in here talking about practice.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Out, Charlie! Out!
Our next door neighbors are foreign countries.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Remember Shuffle. My name is Ben. With me as always is my co-host Giordano.
Good golly, part 3. Is there really enough to talk about here? I mean, why would we need more time to talk about the occupation compared to the invasion itself? That's me doing Rumsfeld, by the way. There's not enough people left for me to do an impression of, unless I want to break out my legendary Muqtada el-Sadr impression.
Please don't. No impressions of other races. That's one of the commandments of Remember Shuffle.
That should have been one of Paul Bremer's first CPA directives. The no impressions of other races.
Debothify the country, disband the military, no impressions of the Iraqis. Yes, and as Giordano said, welcome to part 3 of our ongoing series on the Iraq War. I'm going to do my best to say Iraq every time. I'm working on it. I'm holding myself accountable. And today we will be discussing the first year of the American occupation of Iraq, the Green Zone, and the CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, and we will also do a very, very brief review of a bad and forgettable film starring Matt Damon called Green Zone. Kind of about this topic, but not really. Here is our thesis for the episode. The opening phases of the Iraq War went extremely well for Americans in terms of beating Saddam, but that was never in doubt. The occupation goes extremely poorly due to lack of troops, lack of strategy, and a blind faith in free market ideology. So this episode is going to be about this first year of the occupation and exactly how it went so poorly. Specifically, we're going to try and focus a lot on the lived experience of Iraqis.
There's a great quote from Bremer in his book, My Year in Iraq, where he's frustrated about 6 months in. And he says, "How could we hit artillery positions at night in a dust storm so accurately, but not be able to turn the power back on and restore electricity to pre-invasion levels?" And I think that's a great quote for identifying what the problems are going to be as we move from invasion to occupation in that first year. We are so good at destroying civilian infrastructure. We're so much less effective at repairing civilian infrastructure.
It is, in fact, much easier to destroy than create.
Yeah, anyone who's ever played Jenga. No.
Bibliographical note, here is what we read for this episode. We read some great fucking books for this. So the number one source that we used was Imperial Life in the Emerald City Inside Iraq's Green Zone by Rajiv Chandrasekharan,
who's a journalist. Their job is to write, and so these books are typically easier to read. They're great at finding sources from a bunch of different areas. This is the best source. If you're going to read one of these, we'd probably recommend this one.
Yeah. We also read All or Part of Baghdad Burning by the blogger Riverbend. Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine has some chapters on Iraq. It's just also a great book that I would recommend anyone read. Thomas Ricks's Fiasco, which we used as one of our main sources last episode. We used a bit of the second half. And Giordano, God's Toughest Soldier, read... What's the title of the book, Giordano?
Paul Bremer wrote a book. It's not quite his autobiography. It's called My Year in Iraq. I think he wanted to point out through the title of his book that he was just stopping by. The whole thing is not his fault. He was only there for a year.
I'm so much more than my year in Iraq,
Just to do some signposting for this episode, I thought that last week it worked out well with doing our characters first, and then we'll talk generally about why the occupation failed so hard. And then we'll do our history lesson, starting with the war against Saddam and settling up the occupation sort of quarter by quarter, switching between our sources here. And then we'll get into our themes for the occupation as a whole in this first year, including the completely delusion of daily life in the Green Zone, the fact that the insurgents learned it from us. The way that they target civilian infrastructure is so similar to what we were doing prior to the invasion. The incompetence of everyone involved, especially in the CPA, considering that they were staffed by GOP operatives. Young, idealistic GOP operatives.
And on top of the incompetence, you also have malice. You also have, like, doing bad shit on purpose. We'll talk a little bit about the freaking news, the media, both outside of and within Iraq. We'll talk about America making its own little proto-ISIS, and I guess a theme that we'll just call Resolve.
And lastly, we'll do our mini movie review of The Green Zone. Horrible movie. Really boring stuff.
Yeah, the last 2 episodes we watched films that we liked and would recommend, but this is just like, here is a movie that is loosely inspired by our main source for the episode. I got a couple interesting things to say about it, but it is a bad film.
Okay, let's talk about our characters. The dramatis personae. We got Paul Jerry Bremer. I don't know why people call him Jerry, but Paul Bremer, he's the viceroy of Iraq. We're really dusting off a classic title for this one.
I don't know how the Iraqis could have possibly thought that it was a war of conquest and looting. Here's your viceroy. What they should have called him is a vizier, you know?
I mean, Roy is a king, right? So this is a vice king. Basically. But yeah, he's in charge of the Coalition Provisional Authority.
And where to fucking start with this guy? This guy is the most responsible for the occupation, right? And here's 3 things that will come up again and again when we talk about Bremer. But actually, before I say my 3 things, Giordano, I know why he's called Jerry. Do you know why?
Why?
He is an adult convert to Catholicism. He and J.D. Vance both found the one true faith, Habemus Papam, and his patron saint when he converted as an adult was Saint Jerome. And so he had people call him Jerry after Saint Jerome. Again, how could the Iraqis have thought it was some kind of rerun of the Crusades? Here's an adult convert to Catholicism who is the highest authority in your land. But here are the 3 things that are going to come up again and again when we talk about Bremer. He is a true believer zealot in free market liberalism. So when Rajiv, the author of Imperial Life in the Emerald City, asked him what his top priority is as the head administrator of this occupation, he said it was economic reform. The electricity is still off, and basic services aren't being provided, and he's focused on putting liquidity in the hands of the people and, quote, corporatizing and privatizing state-owned enterprises to wean people from the idea that the state supports everything.
Yeah, it's wild how much they thought the invisible hand would reconstruct Iraq.
He came to Iraq not just to make it a democracy, but to make it a free market. He's quoted as saying, if we don't get their economy right, no matter how fancy our political transformation, it won't work. He's also just a total control freak with some power fantasies of his own. So Viceroy was a nickname. His official title was Chief Executive Authority of the Coalition Provisional Authority, but he treated his job like he was a viceroy, and that's why people called him that. He ran the CPA like he was the president of a mini White House. He mimicked the schedule with the morning security briefings. There was no parliament or council or anything that could hold him accountable. Just Paul Bremer's word and signature could erase a law or add a new one. He set up his job in such a way that he had basically zero oversight, and he reported only directly to the president. And some people at the State Department found it was easier to keep tabs on Bremer just by watching the news about what he was doing, rather than try and reach out to him. Because on top of being a control freak, he was not very communicative. And of course, he was a lifelong conservative GOP operative. He worked for some of our favorite ghouls, Henry Kissinger in the 70s, and then Reagan's Secretary of State, Alexander Haig. If you don't know much about Haig, check out his Wikipedia for a wild read. He thought that to keep the Russians in line, maybe a nuclear warning shot might be a good move. You know, just like sending a nuke somewhere over Europe just to, keep them in line. Yeah, he was a 61-year-old workaholic, lifelong GOP member who had the right politics, and that's exactly who the Bush administration wanted.
Our next character that we'll be mentioning a lot in this episode is a blogger named Riverbend, who was an incredible source. She's a 24-year-old woman in Iraq at this time, and she speaks amazing English, writes very eloquently. She's from a mixed Sunni and Shia family, and before the invasion, she worked as a computer programmer, but after the invasion, there's so much pressure pressure from religious authorities to not allow women to work in jobs like this, that she's let go from her job. And so she has all this free time and she spends it reading the news and being incredibly well informed and blogging about it. And you read all these books by like Paul Bremer and journalists and like George Bush, and you don't really understand how like a regular person in Iraq feels that often. And so I found that Riverbend's blog posts and book were so insightful at understanding what daily life in Iraq was like for people in Baghdad specifically. And she not only writes about historical events that are happening around her, but also just about Iraqi culture at large. She'll have a post about the process in which you make and serve tea to your family, or like how to dine during a Ramadan breaking of the fast. And so these are just like an incredible window into like Iraqi life of an average person in Baghdad at this time.
Yeah, it's tough reading at times, but her source paints Iraqis as real human beings, because sometimes in some of the Western sources, they come off as these faceless masses, like you're a looter or you're an insurgent, or they are just victims of history being acted upon. And she shows all of the different ways that these Iraqis have to adjust to life in a military occupation.
I'll put a link to her blog in the description. And I know that we said The Green Zone is like the best thing you could read, but I would also just recommend just like flip through a couple blog posts and see if it appeals to you, because she's an amazing writer and it's truly a unique perspective that you won't get anywhere else.
She didn't write under her real name for security reasons, obviously. That's why she's Riverbend. And at a certain point, she and her family had to flee Iraq and they moved to Syria. And she's been quiet ever since. So given what the West did to that country, I sincerely hope that she's still with us.
This source was a recommendation from a fan of the podcast. So shout out to Instagram user Rar Niche, who recommended this book to me and blog.
Nice. Okay, another major character in this period that we probably should have introduced earlier is Ahmed Chalabi.
Oh, baby. One of the most fascinating figures from this entire thing.
His fingerprints are all over every phase of the Iraq War, and we probably didn't do a good enough job of introducing him earlier, but in every source we read, he crops up somewhere, usually in some kind of corruption or attempted oligarch sort of way. And at a certain point in my research, I just started writing in the margins, there he is.
Just to give someone a broad overview who isn't familiar at all with him, he's the US government and the CIA's guy. This is who our best bet is for who's going to lead the country after Saddam is toppled, because he's someone who is familiar to us and malleable and agreeable to American sensibilities. The fact that he's a math degree from a Western university that he graduated early from, that type of credentialism, I think, appeals to people in America. And we're like, oh, of course they would want to be led by this guy who hasn't lived in Iraq since, checks notes, 1958, when he was 13 years old. And since then has just been a lifelong swindler.
Yeah, just an absolute fraudster. Had to flee Jordan, it is rumored, in the back of a trunk of a car that was itself stolen from the Jordanian royal family because he had embezzled hundreds of millions of dollars. He eventually sets up shop in England and America, and he founds the Iraqi National Congress, a lobbying and fundraising group whose goal is regime change in Iraq. So obviously, given that that's what his politics are, the neocons love him. The Defense Department, where most of the neocons set up shop, they love him. State Department and the CIA are a little bit cool on him, but why he matters for the story, like I said, his fingerprints are all over it. His influence on the neocons. They love the Iraqi National Congress. He provides a bunch of the bogus intelligence in the lead up to the war. The narrative that he sold the neocons and Defense Department is part of why the war happened. He's promising them like, oh yeah, I'll be your guy. I'll come in, I'll handle everything. Because he wants to be president of Iraq. He wants to be installed as president of Iraq by the Americans. And so for a lot of people, we'll put Chalabi in charge, was their like intellectual panacea for all of the problems of Iraq. Like, we have a government in waiting. We got our boy Chalabi and the Iraqi National Congress made up of all these exiles.
Fatefully, he has zero legitimacy in Iraq. He has not been there since the 1950s. Nobody knows who he is, apart from the fact that they know he's wanted in Jordan for embezzling money. And critically, the first thing he does when he's in Iraq is to hijack the cars of a bunch of people in the anarchy period post-invasion. Like, he has a bunch of goons, and they go around just stealing cars and saying these are being taken by the Ahmed Chalabi militia. And so Riverbend is a great source here because it's so clear to her so early on. Like, in 2003, she's writing about Chalabi quite often, and like those are some of her funniest posts. Because she hates Chalabi. And she talks about how literally every Iraqi she knows thinks that this guy is a fucking moron. Nobody likes this guy at all. And it's just so funny to compare that to like American sources, because they're always trying to push Chalabi until they realize that, oh, this is not the guy. And then we know that finally when elections do happen, that he gets like 1% of the vote. But her quotes about Chalabi always make me laugh. So here's a quote from Riverbend about Chalabi in like 2003. If Bremer has learned anything about the Iraqi people, he would hand Chalabi over to the Jordanian authorities with a red ribbon around his neck as a sign of goodwill. I haven't seen a single person in Iraq who likes the rat. This is a guy who the U.S. will appoint to the governing council.
He's the president in waiting, Giordano. It's his turn.
One of my favorite Chalabi swindles is him telling the CIA that he has hired an army of like 1,000 militants ready to go to retake Iraq. And so he's like, I need payroll for like these 1,000 people. And so the CIA provides him with payroll for an army. And when they get there, it's just immediately clear that he's pocketing all of this money. There's nobody there. It seems so easy to fool the CIA if you just like present what they want, what they're already looking for, right? Which is like, oh, we need people to overthrow Saddam. We mentioned in our Saddam episode the PowerPoint deck that they have for, so you want to overthrow your government, you know?
Bob Woodward has this funny detail. He says when Chalabi shows up back in Iraq for the first time, he's wearing a hat that just says George Bush on it. Like truly a how do you do fellow Iraqis moment.
Yep.
All right, let's move on.
Yeah.
To al-Sistani. Al-Sistani is a major Shia cleric who has a ton of legitimacy in Iraq, especially in the south. And he critically understands that democracy will be good for the Shias because they outnumber the Sunnis. And so he does everything he can to convince people that this democratic election needs to happen as soon as possible. And nothing can happen without it being democratically chosen, because he knows that in any voting system, Shias will have the upper hand.
Yeah, he's a guy with whom the Americans could have worked, but they didn't really treat him with gravitas. This is the top Shia cleric of Iraq, and when they send feelers out to talk to him, they first send a urologist, again, like a GOP donor operative who happened to be at the CPA, and then they try sending like a pharma exec. They are really dismissive of him, and he eventually declares a fatwa against any government that is installed or appointed without a democratic election. Just a missed opportunity, and a guy who will be a thorn in Bremer's side as he attempts to do exactly that, as he attempts to appoint people to draft the interim constitution so that the Americans can kind of control the process.
And he'll point out that if you're appointing people to write a constitution, these people should be democratically elected, knowing that it can be favorable to Shias if it's democratically elected. The last figure, who's really probably going to be more important in the next episode, but we'll give him a shout out here, is Muqtada al-Sadr. You know, he's about 29-year-old Shia cleric, the son of a very influential Shia cleric killed by Saddam in the 90s. And he's one of the first major resistance figures to the Americans, the first person to really call them out in public for transgressions.
There's a whole neighborhood of Baghdad named after his father, Sadr City, formerly Saddam City, then renamed after his father who was killed. And he's still around. He's still kicking. And he's probably a future leader of Iraq, because in the last election they ran, his bloc won the most seats. He claims to have retired from politics in 2022, but he's only 50. He'll be back. Don't worry.
Al-Sadr City, a neighborhood in Baghdad with 2.5 million people, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, predominantly Shia, where Saddam would have put poor Shia people.
It's got sewage in the streets. That's how much Saddam underinvested in the Shia slum to keep them down.
And so typically we described our characters here, and it's generally speaking, our characters are like people involved in the CPA, ordinary Iraqis, the exiles, like Chalabi, like Alawi. And then the other group of characters here are Shia clerical leaders. From what I understand about Shia Islam is that it's a bit more community oriented, like less individualistic. And so you have a lot of religious authority figures like clerics or ayatollahs that tend to have a lot of sway with the community that they operate in. And so there are a number of these Shia clerics in this episode, but these are the two biggest ones, I would say, Al-Sadr and Sistani.
So why did this occupation fail so hard? And there are three basic reasons. Americans couldn't provide security, they couldn't provide services, and their free market zealotry fucked everything up. So for security, from the moment Baghdad falls, the looting begins. Because of the war plans that had no grand strategy, they never had enough guys to secure the country. And for context, when America occupied Japan after World War II, they brought 1 million troops. In Iraq, they brought 155,000. This looting, in turn, had horrendous knock-on effects, including the lack of services, the second point. The very skeletal basic plan that they had drawn up involved sending in Americans to take over Iraqi ministries. These ministries would try and keep the economy and the basic services up and running to the best of their ability. We want to have some kind of continuity with this brief interruption from our shock and awe war. But because they can't provide security, every single ministry is looted to the point that there's nothing left. Except for which ministry, Giordano? Which is the one that didn't get looted again?
I think it was the healthcare ministry. No, the Ministry of Oil was famously the only building given protection by the U.S. Army during the looting.
So this means that first the OHRA, the Organization for Humanitarian and Reconstruction Administration or some shit like that, and then the CPA, they first need to do basic reconstruction in order to get any kind of baseline services, neither of which can be done without security.
These civil services, things like water, electricity, sewage, they've been disrupted by 12 years of U.S. bombing of civilian infrastructure and of sanctions not allowing us to repair anything, right? We mentioned on our last episode both the Gulf War and Operation Desert Fox, and then the sanctions that would not allow you to actually repair anything. And there's a quote from Bremer in his autobiography where he says, "My advisors told me that Iraq's 3 major refineries were so old and poorly maintained under Saddam's command economy that this critical component of the energy industry might soon seem to function," right? So he's blaming Saddam, like, how could you have let things get this bad? And it's like, bro, we destroyed all of this stuff and wouldn't allow them to import anything to fix it. It's so funny to be like, bro, get it together.
Yeah, you made this problem. And then on top of these two problems of security and services, you have the fact that the CPA is run by these Milton Friedmanites. Saddam's Iraq had an economy with a lot of state intervention to help meet people's needs. But we needed to build a free market economy. Employment be damned, shortages be damned. It's shock therapy time.
Yeah, I need to look up synonyms for galling in the thesaurus because I don't want to keep using this word, but it really is galling that we would go into a country and be like, you know what your problem is? You're using a command economy. You're not allowing the free market to dictate how much healthcare reaches people, you know, or how many like food stuffs reach people. All of these Project for a New American Century people are going to come in. I think Naomi Klein said it was like the laboratory for free market policy because a lot of the interventions that we're doing here, like a lot of the changes that we're doing in their economy is stuff that we would not allow in America. There would be protests here if we like took away some of these public provisions of goods. And we're like, well, we'll foist it on the Iraqis because we can. Because we
fucking can.
Yeah. And we have these like emergency powers. We can get around having democratic consensus for removing the healthcare system or the food rations or the employment programs.
Yeah. There's our table setting. Let's talk history. So this is covering from March to April 2003. Where we last left off, the war had started. And this is going to be a short fucking section here.
This is our section on like the invasion itself, the U.S. versus Saddam's army battle. The only part of this entire thing that we actually planned for, by the way.
The easiest, lowest hanging fruit part of it. That's what the bit that we planned for, yeah. Thomas Ricks called America's campaign plan quote, perhaps the worst plan in American history because they planned for a few battles and they had zero plan to secure the victory after the fact.
Yeah. And I told Ben, actually covering USA versus Saddam's Iraqi army, it just feels like such an afterthought. Like in our last episode, there's entire books written about all the meetings that Rumsfeld and the Defense Department had to discuss, oh, do we have a plan for invading Iraq? But all they're planning is just about this 1 month period. And it's like, of course, the United States is going to win, right? This is the New York Yankees versus the Colorado Iraqis, you know?
Ooh, nice. I see what you did there. Yeah.
This is a 15-year conflict, and the only part that was planned was this first 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm. The invasion force, as we saw in the last episode, was small. 145,000 troops, that's with the Brits. Just 247 tanks, which doesn't seem like a lot. I don't know. I'm not a general. And it's crazy because on paper, the Iraqi military fielded 400,000 troops and 4,000 tanks, but it doesn't matter. Like, the Iraqi army was told to stay home, and most of them did. The only people fighting were, like, the Republican Guard and some of Saddam's elite troops. But the Americans' plan hinged on Iraqi units defecting, as promised by their CIA and intel. Not a single commander did so the Americans had to fight through basically every town. But the result was never in doubt. And remember that debate about troop numbers in the lead up to the war that we talked about in part 2? That kept happening even publicly as the war was happening. They were debating troop numbers. And our favorite neocon ghoul, Paul Wolfowitz, is out there saying, I don't see why it would take more troops to occupy the country than to take down the regime as they are invading the fucking country.
And remember when we read Generation Kill, how like the soldiers are complaining the entire time about the lack of resources and planning? And I remember reading that book and thinking, damn, soldiers love to complain. And it wasn't until I started reading these books where I was like, oh, this isn't just like a regular guy complaining about his job. There actually was a fundamental misunderstanding of how many troops would be needed to conquer a country of 40 million people.
Mm-hmm. The U.S. does indeed do their speed kills move. Rather than surround Baghdad and move in slowly, the army decides to do, I'm not even joking, this is what they call it, 2 thunder runs with their tanks into the city. Extremely effective. Fighting is heavy. By April 7th, the American military had taken Baghdad. And there's a difference between tactics and strategy. Not to be a fucking war nerd about this, but Thomas Rick says a strategy is based off of 4 questions. Who are we? What are we trying to do here? How will we do it? And what resources and means will we employ in doing it? You answer those 4 questions, and then you have your strategy. And once you have your strategy, you can build your tactics around whatever your goal is. And the U.S. military's problem is that they have decent tactics, but they have no strategy whatsoever.
Right. This is really the point that I think will help you understand why so much of what's written about the war in Iraq is so stupid. If you watch the movie American Sniper, or like, have you ever listened to Jocko Willenick's podcast? He'll describe in detail why every single raid he ever did was the most tactically sound raid pulled off without a hitch, but none of the tactics of the military are aligned with the correct strategy. The strategy is to ingratiate yourself to the local population. So when Jocko is doing a raid and is like speeding down the sidewalk and causing people to have to like jump out of the way, and then going into the house, terrorizing the neighborhood, grabbing the wrong person, like technically speaking, it's the perfect raid. Unfortunately, all of the things that they did to do it run counter to our strategic goals of not having the local people hate us. You know, so it's like, great, tactically the Tomahawk missile hit its target. Sound. Unfortunately, the strategic goal of destroying the civilian infrastructure is not good. Yeah. I do like your point here about American military hubris, right? Mm-hmm. We talked in our Three Kings movie review about how we were so excited after the Gulf War to have exorcised the ghost of Vietnam, right? And it's like, hey, remind me again, what was that ghost haunting us with? The ghost was telling us, beware getting involved in conflicts with no clear exit strategy and asymmetrical warfare. Well, I'm glad we exorcised that ghost. Like, sometimes ghosts are there for a reason, you know? How about the wisdom of Vietnam? Why does it have to be the ghost of Vietnam?
100%. Yeah, the U.S. between Vietnam and 2003, they put up some dubs, right? They got the 1991 Gulf War as a dub for them. And then they have a bunch of these very small-scale dubs. Panama in 89, Kuwait 91, Haiti 94, Bosnia 96, Kosovo 99, where they didn't get bogged down in a quagmire, where they had some kind of overarching strategy that they wanted to do. And they lost their edge. And now they're going into something with absolutely no strategy. So April 9th is the famous statue pull down moment. As a reminder, the war starts March 19th or 20th, depending on your time zone. So this is like 3 weeks later. And the military historian Rick Atkinson, who was embedded, called it as good as it got. The high watermark of the invasion was pulling down that fucking statue. But the electricity still isn't on and the basic services aren't there. And as soon as this statue comes down, the looting begins. And honestly, I don't blame the Iraqis. If you don't know what's happening, you have all this pent up fear, anger, frustration. You don't know what's waiting for you on the other side. Get what you can, man. Stock up for what's coming. But when this is raised by journalists to Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, about the looting and the lack of security, Donald Rumsfeld has this juicy quote where he says, "Stuff happens, but in terms of what's going on in that country, it is a fundamental misunderstanding to see those images over and over and over again of some boy walking out with a vase and say, 'Oh my goodness, you didn't have a plan.' That's nonsense. They know what they're doing, and they're doing a terrific job. And it's untidy. And freedom's untidy. And free people are free to make mistakes and commit crimes and do bad things. They're also free to live their lives and do wonderful things. And that's what's going to happen there."
Yeah, I feel like whenever Rumsfeld talks about looting, he loves to talk about it in terms of a boy stealing a vase. He has that other quote where he's like, my goodness, how many vases were there? And it's like, bro, when I think about the looting, for the most part, I'm thinking about like all of the computers at all of the ministries and businesses. Like they weren't all decorative objects. But I love his little reframing as like essentially aesthetic things that were stolen.
I can't remember exactly when Donald Rumsfeld died. I know he's no longer with us, but I wonder what his opinion of the riots in 2020 was. Did he think freedom's untidy and free people are allowed to do free things? Do you think that was his opinion?
But at this point, our goodwill from the Iraqi people is very quickly evaporating. You know, you see it in the blogs around the 6-month mark as the summer starts to heat up. All of the goodwill engendered by taking out Saddam is basically almost gone, as the electricity is still lower than pre-war levels.
Yeah. The message that's sent by the fact that they can't stop this looting is either we don't care about the looting or we are incapable of stopping it because we don't have enough soldiers. And both of those messages are bad for the Iraqis. Okay, so that's the war. Mission accomplished, I believe, is around this time, right?
Yes, yeah, April.
In April of 2003, Bush gets his mission accomplished moment. But at this point, the war's over. Let's roll out the military occupation. And we start with the ORHA era. This is a plan to have a group called the ORHA, the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance. To the extent that they did any planning for the occupation, this is the closest they got, and it's under motherfucking Doug Feith's office. Listen to our last episode for more on him. And this group is a skeleton crew. They assumed that a handful of Americans would take over the Iraqi ministries. A new interim government, probably headed by Ahmed Chalabi, would be named and appointed. And then new ministers were appointed.
Let's go, in and out, 20 minutes adventure.
And the whole thing is a very low rent, low effort, slapdash thing. Here are some of the appointees. A mid-level American bureaucrat from Treasury was given the Iraqi Ministry of Education. A former ambassador got the Trade Ministry. And an engineer from the U.S. Corps of Engineers got transportation and communication, housing and construction, irrigation, and electricity. And after the fall of Baghdad, they also added health to his portfolio. Here you go, random engineer from the Army Corps of Engineers. You are now 5 cabinet ministers. And it's not just that they're overburdened and underfunded. They were also way out of their depth. So there's this guy, Carney, I forget his first name. It's not Mark, but that's the Canadian Prime Minister. But he's one of these higher ups. He bought a biography of the minister he was about to replace, but he had no idea how many workers or factories or state-run companies were part of his ministry.
Yeah, the way that Green Zone book is organized is every chapter is sort of like a different ministry, like either health or the stock market or transportation, and he'll just do a deep dive on why that specific section failed. So that's why that book I really liked, because it was organized sort of by department like this. But you just see the same story over and over again, where these people are completely out of their depth.
Yeah. And one part of the reason this was so shitty, this doesn't explain all of it, but there was a bureaucratic pissing match between the Defense Department, where all the neocons lived, and the State Department, which trended more realist. So the State Department actually produced 2,500 pages of policy recommendations called The Future of Iraq. And Jay Garner, the head of the ORHA, never even got to see it because the state and defense didn't like each other. As we said up top, the looting destroys these industries. So there's a 10-story building for the Ministry of Industry. It's completely picked bare. And shout out to these looters and their chutzpah. Not only did they strip the copper wiring from the wall, they stole 10-ton government dump trucks and filled them with shit from the building, and then torched the entire building to the ground.
Blowback mentioned it, where the ORHA people are seeing the buildings on fire one by one and going, oh, there goes education, there goes health.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good, oil's still standing.
And the ORHA guys are like trying to get into the country. They're stuck in Kuwait, but the military doesn't fly them in until 12 days after the US troops had taken the city. These are the people who are supposed to step in and make sure that there's no chaos, and they don't have time to do it. And I would like to read this little exchange as a dialogue between Barbara Bodine, who was about to become the interim mayor of Baghdad. She actually spoke Arabic, one of the few competent people in this story, and CENTCOM, as looters are about to break into the central bank to get to a priceless collection of Assyrian gold. Janae, why don't you be CENTCOM? I'll be Bodine.
Okay.
The Assyrian vault under the central bank is in immediate danger of being looted. We need to get on this.
Okay, what's in this Assyrian vault?
Assyrian treasure.
What's an Assyrian treasure?
Go read the early chapters of your Bible. It's old stuff. It's really, really valuable. We need to save it.
Okay, we'll see what we can do.
This building would eventually get burned to the ground, and the Assyrian gold would never be recovered. So yeah, in this period, the ORHA guys, they can't do their job because there isn't enough security. There aren't enough troops to escort them to their ministries to try and get the country back on running. There are 10 military police for the 36 people who need to be ferried around Baghdad. There's either 0 hours electricity, or maybe they get 3 hours electricity a day. There's no phones. There's no email. The things you need to make logistics happen. None of it's there. They are so unprepared that they don't even have a fucking map of Baghdad. The lead guy is using a tourist map of Baghdad that he picked up in the airport. This is their level of unpreparedness.
They say we don't realize the mess we're getting in.
Thank you, Giordano. Yeah, and this group, whose mission was so critical for the success of post-war Iraq, was so poorly thought out that they didn't even have a place to house these people. And this is why they eventually settle on the Republican Palace in Baghdad, around which the Green Zone would eventually grow. And these people, they know the optics are horrible. The minds of the occupying force are setting up shop in one of Saddam's palaces. But they need a site that's close to Baghdad and all the ministers it's supposedly taken over, as well as one that you could set up a perimeter around to make a bubble. There's like two guys behind the OHRA. There's Tim Carney and Jim Garner. And Tim Carney had worked in Cambodia with Kissinger. Yikes. And he knew Khmer. And so whenever he wanted to write something that he didn't want someone reading, he would write in Khmer in his diary. And he wrote, "Are we in teething problems or fatally flawed in concept?" He also wrote in his diary, you have to have a plan, you have to have lots of money, and you got to have really good staff. And I read this and went, hey, 0 for 3 ain't bad. At this point, he has 2 guys on his staff to handle a ministry that employs 100,000 people. It's too much for a fucking Iannucci film, right? If you made this as a satire, people would think it was too much.
Yeah, this is too cynical over how the U.S. would handle something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, quoting the Emerald City book directly, had there been no looting, had the police stayed on the streets, had Iraq's infrastructure not been whittled to incapacitation by Saddam's government, then perhaps an outfit such as OHRA, with no plan, no money, and a skeletal staff would have been appropriate. Brutal stuff. And so things are still in flux, and one of the big question marks is, when do the Iraqis take over? What will the governing structure of Iraq be? How much power should be handed over to the Iraqis? To which Iraqis? And there are two schools of thought. You got the Defense Department and you got the State Department. Defense wants to put the Iraqi exiles in charge, and they want to do it real fucking quick. They want to put the exiles that have been working with America for a long time. They're known. The exiles also really, really want it. They're all power-hungry, wannabe oligarchs. This plan is we're going to have an unelected transitional government installed by the Americans.
The key point here is that already 1 month in, the civilian leadership of George Bush, they're already so bored with this. They're like, the invasion was fun. I don't want to be here anymore. You know, there's an election coming up. Remember when I said that Colin Powell told George Bush, this will be a dark cloud over your first term? Mm-hmm. This is their thinking. Like, Bremer tells them he's going to need like a year to do elections. And Rumsfeld and Bush are like, a year? They're balking. They're like, bro, you need to figure this out sooner. That's the level of optimism that we have going into this occupation.
Yep. Now, the State Department, they want the power to stay with the Americans, either some kind of military commander or a civilian governor, until a representative group of Iraqis, exiles as well as, quote, internals, as they came to be called, could be selected to form a government. There would have to be elections, as well as a new constitution, a referendum on that constitution, and then America would hand over the keys. And then the guy on the ground, Garner, who has some power, he wanted elections within 90 days, and he even says that to the press. And defense is pissed off because their boys, the exiles, would do extremely poorly in the elections. But after meeting some of the Kurdish exiles, defense starts to come around to this idea of getting the elections going sooner. I say all this because, what the fuck? Why didn't you figure this out before the invasion, right? These are major, structural, existential questions about what you are going to do after you knock out Saddam, and the administration itself doesn't even agree on what they're going to do.
Yeah, they were just like, oh yeah, Chalabi or something. Remember when I was talking about those meetings on our last episode where Doug Feith is like, let's hold a meeting to discuss who we're going to put on the money after Saddam, right?
Yeah.
Like, how about figuring out what should the electoral process look like? Like, Bremer talks about in his book, he mentions like, okay, sure, you want to have elections. What election system do you want to use, right? How are you going to decide what the electoral map looks like? You don't have a census. You need to do a census before you can even think about what the parliament will look like. We're talking about a year roadway before we could even get elected people in a position where elected people could write a constitution rather than us hand selecting people to write a constitution.
Yeah. So finally, people in Washington actually start to think about the next move. Now, Giordano, I'm going to read you a quote from the Emerald City book, and I want you to guess who you think they're talking about. The plan all along was to have a man of stature take charge in Baghdad. But what would his role be? Would he be an ambassador-like figure supporting an exile-led transitional government? Or would he be more of a viceroy who would administer the country until elections or some other participatory process identified representative leaders? Who are they talking about? Who is this man of stature that they're thinking about?
Chalabi?
Great guess. I also thought they were talking about an Iraqi when I read that. They're like, we just need to find the right Iraqi. The following sentence, the following paragraph begins, Bush, Cheney, Rice, and Rumsfeld batted around names. Former New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, the hero of 9/11, was felt out. Could you imagine?
We were so close to having Giuliani in the Bremer role.
Yeah.
Maybe they wanted Giuliani because they thought as an Italian, he might have insights into federalizing a more tribal society.
All right, Iraq, we took out your dictator. Here's our ugliest guy. He will molest your daughters.
He says he has contacts in the area, including a Borat Necessities.
So yes, at this point, the ORHA would be dissolved in April of 2003 to be replaced with the Coalition Provisional Authority. Its job was to be a caretaker administration until the Iraqis could take over for themselves, but they still have no plan to get to that point. of the Iraqis taking over for themselves, and it would be the government of Iraq until June 28th, 2004. And now is when we enter Paul Bremer III. Jay Garner is quietly fired, and his subordinates tell him not to beat himself up because, quote, you were set up to fail. Which, could be the title of this entire episode. Set up to fail.
Yeah. Okay, so now we got our CPA. So if you remember anything from the U.S. occupation, you probably remember the letters CPA. And they're the people in charge of Iraq until June 2004, when this episode will roughly cover. As we've mentioned, Paul Bremer is in a position that has absolute power and is completely unelected. He is a morning psycho control freak workaholic. I think Emerald City mentions at first that he was sleeping in a room with no air conditioning because he wanted to see what it was like, but quickly switched to a room with air conditioning because he doesn't really get into it. But I think the implication is that he's like, I'm no use to anyone not sleeping every night.
Yeah, he's the master of the photo op. He does press briefings like he's the president of Iraq because he basically is. With the stroke of his pen, he can pass or nullify any law, doesn't even need to consult with any Iraqis, and he's not accountable to anyone but the president. This level of concentrated, unaccountable power would not be tolerated anywhere in America.
And I'll step in to defend my friend Jerry here because it's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem, right? Where it's like, okay, well, you want someone elected. Well, now you have to have elections. And where do you start with that? And so as much as it's easy to dunk on Bremer, it's so hard for me to find him personally culpable because this is the Kobayashi Maru. This is the unsolvable problem. And of course, he does not do a great job, but it's hard for me to blame him any more than I would Don Rumsfeld. Because he's being put in an impossible position. And, there's this great story from Paul Bremer in his book where Donald Rumsfeld is making his first visit out to Iraq. And he looks around at all of these CPA officials and people working in the green zone and says, I wish you guys had a little bit more urgency. And the room goes silent. Rumsfeld is reprimanding them, saying like, hey, why isn't this done already? It's been a few months. Come on, let's wrap this up. And Bremer has to stop and take a couple breaths, because he doesn't want to react emotionally, and he's a career diplomat.
Yep.
And he says, there's thousands of people here voluntarily working 18 to 20 hours a day, from the people in the kitchens to people like myself. Trust me, there is urgency from everyone who's choosing to spend their time in Iraq right now. And Rumsfeld is taken a little bit aback by this, and it's a little awkward for a moment. And he says, well, if you have urgency, then you need to get your priorities right. And Bremer retorts that security is the number one priority. You can't do anything without security, and we don't have that right now. And that interaction is so funny to me because we put more money into Iraq nominally than we did into Europe during the Marshall Plan. But the issue was always around security, right? It wasn't as effective because there was lawlessness. And the guy he's saying this to, Donald Rumsfeld, is the guy who, if you recall, in our last episode, has just spent the last 18 months wheedling down the number of troops that we're going to be bringing into Iraq. Right? And so when fucking Doug Feith and Donald Rumsfeld every week are coming back and saying, you don't need this many troops, you don't need this many troops. This is the real world impact of them doing that for the last year, is that the U.S. has no ability to keep security in the country. And so he's saying this to the person who was most responsible for the fact that the security was so bad. And I doubt that Donald Rumsfeld has enough self-awareness to understand that. So that's why it's hard for me to hold it against Paul Bremer, where it's like the Coalition Provisional Authority in a country where we gave the military, what was it, like a quarter of the number of troops that they asked for?
Yeah, not set up for success. I will be the Paul Bremer hater and say his biggest wins come towards the end of the CPA, as we'll see. And his wins come from when he tries to do less and he trusts the Iraqis to do stuff, even at the expense of his bosses. But we'll get to that later.
Yeah, he does not start strong. In fact, CPA Directives 1 and 2 will be his largest blunders.
Listen, it was his first day on the job. As Homer said, it's my first day.
Homer, you instilled debathification and disbanded the military? It's my first day.
Yes. So in March 2003, there's a debate about what de-Baathification will mean and what it will look like. And once again, Pentagon and state disagree on what it will look like. We're going to keep saying this over and over again because this stupid bullshit diplomatic turf war is a huge part of what scuttles any chance for any success here. You saw this in our last episode, defense and state beefing over stuff. Everyone in this story is so focused on the politics in Washington and not nearly focused enough on what is happening in Iraq. But the Pentagon plan is the broader plan. Massive purge. No party members in public office. This plan is also supported by the vice president's office. The state plan says they want de-Saddamification. Get rid of only the guys at the top, the guys closest to the regime, specifically purge those people who had either committed crimes or been at the top of the command structure. This plan is also supported by the CIA. And so one of the problems they hit is that nobody really understands Ba'ath Party structure. They didn't know how many people were at the top, even though this information was readily available on the internet and in various research papers. And significantly, the maximalist view of de-Baathification was supported by Ahmed Chalabi, the Iraqi National Congress, and the exile groups. They wanted the purge to be everyone except for the bottom two levels, cadet and regular members.
And so just to jump in on de-Baathification, if you do recall anything about Paul Bremer, you know that one of his blunders was de-Baathification, essentially barring anyone who is a Ba'ath Party member from participating in the civil government, right? Because they wanted to remove his influence completely. The issue with that, of course, is that it's a single party state. Anyone who wanted to participate in the civil society at all, regardless of their fondness for Saddam, was a Ba'ath Party member. And as you mentioned to me, Ben, you could just be appointed Ba'ath Party membership. It wasn't even always something that you had to seek out yourself.
And so, yeah, his very first executive order is a de-Baathification order, May 16th, 2003. And he goes for the maximalist plan. And so high-level party members are unemployable anywhere, and even just regular members are banned from holding positions in the top 3 layers of management in every national government ministry, affiliated corporations, and other government institutions. And in an Iannucci-like twist, our friend Douglas Feith drafted the maximalist memo that completely contradicted the more compromised position that was reached at a war cabinet meeting in the Oval Office on March 10th. He sends the thing to Bremer, and Bremer signs it. And here's what the consequences of this order are. As we go through this story, I don't have like a running tally of when the unemployment numbers tick up and down, but at a certain point, Iraq's going to have a 65% unemployment rate because of many of these decisions. So Steve Browning, he's that army engineer guy from earlier who was single-handedly running 5 ministries. He tries to tell Bremer not to do this, that the Ba'ath Party members were the brains of the government. They're the ones with a lot of information and knowledge and understanding, and that there would be huge problems. And Bremer just tersely responds, subject's not up for debate. So here's what it looks like in practice. Senior Baathists in the health ministry just stopped coming to work. 8 of the ministry's top 12 posts were empty. 1/3 of all staff was gone. Here's another even worse example. Between 10 and 15,000 teachers were abruptly fired. Welcome to freedom. Your kids can't go to school anymore. And here's another even sadder one. A couple guys in their late 30s lost their jobs for being the 3rd lowest possible rank in the Ba'ath Party. They didn't even want it. They spent 17 years as POWs during the Iran-Iraq War, and Saddam gifted them Ba'ath Party status for being, heroes. The membership came with a $25 a month bonus, and so they came to the Americans and said, just please give us our job back. We don't even want the bonus. And, shout out to Bremer. He gave it to them after 6 months.
Yeah, and critically, I think when you are listening to the neocons talk about de-Baathification, the reason they wanted to do it so badly was because to them, the Ba'ath Party represents a centrally planned economy. And if they really wanted to fundamentally change the way in which Iraqi society functioned, they were going to have to rip all the people out that had centrally planned economy mindset. They don't have end of history brain. And so this to me is the most wanton part of their thinking, is the idea that hey, what Iraqis were doing before, the thing that until Kuwait had led to one of the largest improvements in public health, public education, employment in the Arab world, was actually working quite well for the Iraqis. For us to come in and be let's rip all of that out and make sure that we have a chance for free market liberalism to take hold. That's the real motivation, I think, behind getting rid of all the Ba'ath Party members. These are people who are steeped in centrally planned economy thinking.
And then it makes a whole bunch of busy work for the CPA to figure out who was a Baathist, going through employment records with a fine-tooth comb instead of getting the lights on and getting the factories working again.
Yeah, true.
The really frustrating thing is that there was an Iraqi desire for a clean break with Saddam. Rajiv tells a story about a protest at a factory because the manager was an abusive Baath Party guy, and the workers were demanding that he be replaced. But the Iraqis wanted, and they were initially told by the first organization, by ORHA, that it would be this bottom-up process, maybe like a South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission kind of deal. And instead, what they got was Paul Bremer's executive order. Oh, and just for good measure, when people were pissed off that all the teachers got fired, they had some kind of appeals board for the unemployed teachers to appeal, and motherfucking Ahmed Chalabi was put in charge of it. The guy who wants all of the Baathists gone so that he can have more power.
He may have got this first executive order wrong, but don't worry. I'm sure on his second step up to the plate, he really cranked it out of the park with executive order number 2. No, famously, this is probably the other thing you remember about the CPA, is that they decreed that the entire Iraqi army should be disbanded.
Actually, it's not just the Army, Giordano. It's the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the intelligence services, all of it. Gone. With the stroke of a pen.
Wow.
All the armed forces gone. So 300,000 people got a one-time severance paycheck and were dumped onto the street in a country where unemployment was already 40%.
This is so funny because I was watching an interview with Paul Bremer on Al Jazeera 3 years ago, and he stands by this decision. He says, the only thing we got wrong was we should have announced the severance right away. We waited 2 weeks to give out the severance. But he says, the logic was sound. The idea is you give people a severance bonus, and they use that bonus to start a new business or to learn to code. This is his idealistic worldview, is we're going to give these soldiers a severance payout and they're going to use that to find some other skill set.
Put that in a high interest savings account. Are we sure this guy's not a Democrat? He's literally hitting us with the problem isn't the policy. The problem was the messaging.
Mm-hmm.
He could have a place in the modern Democratic Party.
In a country where your primary concern is security, the first thing you're going to do is to get rid of the army?
Yeah, and I guess in quote defense of this policy, this all goes back to the limited number of troops. So most of the Iraqi army did stay home during the war, but the bases were empty, looted, or destroyed. So for the people who are signing this order, it seems like they were just making concrete what was a fait accompli. But the real thing is money, right? We're going to keep coming back to this point. The occupation had no plan, no money, no people. And reconstituting the armed forces with a call-up would take time, it would take money, and it would take staff that the CPA didn't have. So better to just disband it. Just get it done. And the slapdash compromise that they come up with is just embarrassing, where they say there will be an Iraqi army, but it will be 40,000 guys instead of 400,000 guys. No tanks, no artillery, limited to guarding Iraq's borders, but former soldiers were not guaranteed a position, and you would have to retrain and go through boot camp.
Yeah, and the Iraqi army, especially at the officer level, was largely staffed by both Sunnis and specifically people from around Tikrit. And these two directives, both purging Ba'ath Party membership and the army, are going to have the effect of communicating to the Sunnis that your time in the sun is over, and it's going to make them very worried about reprisals, right? And so you take these 400,000 people who were previously in a position of power, you give power to the Shias and make them unemployed. It is a absolute equation for a civil war. All of the necessary ingredients. And there's this great quote from John Nixon of the CIA, who wrote that book, Debriefing the President, the one about speaking to Saddam. He talks about speaking to George Bush and mentioning the Shias early in the conflict, the difference between Shias and Sunnis. And George Bush says to him, wait, I thought you said these guys were all Muslim. Not understanding the difference between Shia and Sunni Muslims. And these two decisions are going to absolutely exacerbate the ethnic conflicts happening in the country.
Yeah, it's going to create the insurgency. The insurgency first starts in the Sunni triangle. And for a while, the CPA people will use this as an excuse. Oh, it's just the angry Sunnis because they were the minority who had all the power.
They're Saddam loyalists, right? That was their favorite line.
Mm-hmm. But eventually, the insurgency will spread and then develop into a civil war, as we will see in future parts of this series. It's around this time that Bremer makes his decision that there would be no interim government. Can't give the keys to the country to these exiles. These exiles are going to form a governing council that will just advise Bremer. No real power, just an advisory panel.
Yeah, we won't go through the entire governing council, but they're made up of 3 groups primarily. There's a couple Kurdish people, there's a couple Sunnis, and then I think there's like 4 of the 9 are Shias. And it's just like interesting how there's this power vacuum and they appoint these influential Shia people.
Significantly, they're mostly exiles.
Sorry, yeah, the other part that I forgot is that there's a few exiles, and they have the strangest plan for these. They have like 9 months to account for until like their planned transition. And so he gives each of them a month to rule. Everybody gets to be king for a month, basically. And Chalabi is one of these guys, by the way. That's like the level of the people on the council that we're talking about. And Bremer is watching them work, and he's like describing their workday, and he's like, oh, they get late and they take a long lunch and then they go home. He's like, I work more in one day than they do in a week. And he's complaining. And I'm like, bro, you appointed the governing council. You don't get to complain about this. Oh, I'm sorry. Is Ahmed Chalabi not working hard enough? He's complaining that Chalabi is paying his governing council more than the entire educational department. And I'm like, bro, don't be mad at Chalabi. Don't hate the player. Hate the game. Hate yourself. You appointed this guy to the most powerful Iraqi authority in the country.
Yep.
One of my favorite stories from here, when he's speaking to tribal leaders, and one of them says to him, my loyalty and my tribe's loyalty has always been to Iraq. It is written on my heart, and if I ever betray you, I promise that I will give you at least 1 month's notice.
Hell yeah. Let's go.
A hilarious thing to say to someone.
Mm-hmm. So yes, Bremer makes a decision that he'll stay in Iraq and he will do things his way until a new constitution was authored, national elections were held, and a new government was installed. But there's no formal timeline on this. So he suggested this might take 2 years. It's good to be the king. He's telling Iraqis, I might be your viceroy for another 2 years. Don't want to keep hitting the same beats over and over again, but there's a very similar story to what we just saw about the police. The Iraqis need way more. They need to train way more. They need more advisors. There's not enough money. There's not enough staff. There's not enough people. Is a trend emerging. And the Americans send one guy, the 9/11 police chief, dude named Carrick. He hires a posse of Iraqis and he goes around busting heads on night raids, but he doesn't do any kind of major structural reform. He's the sheriff of Baghdad. Someone who worked with him literally said, I wasn't sure what they were trying to achieve other than acting like cowboys out to have a good time. And when this guy leaves Baghdad, he literally says, I was in my own world. I did my own thing. It's like, bro, you had a job to do. It's like your job was to train Iraqi police officers. In your exit interview, you just said, I kind of just did my own thing.
It sounds a lot like whenever Jocko was describing his missions, where it's like, I pulled off my police missions incredibly. I got the guy I was looking for. And it's like, I'm glad that the mission was successful, that had all of these compounding after effects that ruined the entire thing here. I think one of his deputies was Chalabi's deputy.
Yep.
I can't remember his name, but it's the only person that Riverbend says is worse than Chalabi, is like his deputy.
And now we get to the economic reform that the CPA does to do. So Iraq had a bunch of state-owned enterprises that made consumer goods. And a lot of them were substandard products, but they were made with subsidized raw materials, and so they could be sold as cheaper than foreign imports. In the Iraqi economy, electricity was free, even for the giant factories, because they had so much oil wealth. The companies didn't have to pay pensions because the state did that, again, funded by oil wealth. And these state-owned industries had been devastated by the 2 wars and the 13 years of sanctions, or whatever it was. And so that first round of guys in the OHRA, they wanted to get these companies back up and running because substandard goods are better than no goods, right? Better to have the shitty, quote unquote, socialist goods than have shortages. And employment is better than unemployment. And, in the long run, these guys thought, it might not make sense for the Iraqi government to own a vegetable oil factory. But even if you were going to privatize eventually, a functioning company would fetch more money than a non-functioning one. But in the next round with the CPA, we get guys that are far more ideologically committed to the goal of free market liberalization.
This is a microcosm of so many things like this that are happening at this time. But in a centrally planned economy, there's all of these nationalized factories and companies. Like here, we're going to be talking about this vegetable oil nationalized company. There's no reason for the government of Iraq, in the eyes of these people, to own a nationalized vegetable oil company. And so they're dealing with the business of selling these off, trying to get external investors to invest and make them run more like a business. So that's what we're talking about here. And there's this guy, Peter McPherson, who's put in charge of analyzing 150 of these different factories that are owned by the Ministry of Industry.
150 factories, 48 companies. He needs to figure out which are the most viable that the government should keep and which should be sold off for parts. So here's a chunk of dialogue that we can do. It's between McPherson and his analysts. That kind of exemplifies the problem. I'll be McPherson. You have 150 factories. We want you to evaluate them all.
Okay, where's my staff?
It's just you.
Okay, well, where can I find the management of these companies?
Well, we fired most of the management because of debothification.
Okay, where are the financial statements?
There are no financials.
What do you know about these companies?
Nothing. We have a list of the names. Here are the names.
Okay, how much time do I have?
You have 2 weeks.
And it's just me. At least when private equity does these analysis, they have a team to do it. It's not just one guy's job to look at 150 different companies and evaluate their financial feasibility.
Yeah, when they asked the East Germans how they did it, the East Germans said it took them 8,000 guys just to figure out the value of a state-owned enterprise and what it would fetch in a quote-unquote free market.
Just as a reminder, when the Soviet Union fell, we've mentioned on this show before that was the largest drop of human life expectancy in peacetime. That's essentially what we're looking to do in Iraq.
Yeah, and it's worth stressing the chasm of difference in the Iraqi economy before and after wars and sanctions. In the old Iraqi economy, most goods and services subsidized by the government. No one paid for electricity. Gasoline was less than a nickel a gallon. Families received monthly food rations. Education was free, so was healthcare. Fertilizer was so subsidized that some Iraqi farmers sold it in Syria and Jordan because it was more profitable than actually farming. And the healthcare and education systems were considered the best in the Middle East. Other countries had people go to Iraq for medical treatment. And basically all of this is taken away because of Iraq's entanglements with America.
If the plan had just been can we make it 1990 again in Iraq, or make it 1979 again in Iraq, I think they would have been much better set up for success rather than being can we make it 2050 in America? Yeah, just so funny for all of these neocons to be the Iraqi people are suffering due to subsidized public programs. Like education being free.
Yeah, these neoconservative freaks think that the best way to help Iraqis is by spurring growth through the private sector and international investment. No more protectionism. The USAID and Treasury Department produced documents for Iraqi reconstruction where the words tax and privatize were used dozens of times more than the words employment. If you ask an average Iraqi on the street, they will talk about the unemployment rate. That's the number one economic problem on their mind. And they're coming up with a solution that involves firing and liquidating a lot of assets and people. Also on an aside, privatizing another state's assets while you occupy them militarily quite literally violates the Hague Convention of 1899.
Yeah, you're not allowed to sell state assets during an occupation.
And we've used the language of zealotry and idealism because think about this for even 1 second. They are trying to sell to an investor a non-operating factory without electricity and employees that they would have to drive 11 hours from Jordan just to see.
We should mention too, a lot of it will just not happen because the Iraqis just will ignore the decisions of the CPA, knowing that they have no ability to enforce this and they're probably going to have to leave at some point.
Eventually, the mass privatization doesn't happen. And you may think to yourself, whew, dodged a bullet. But here's shrinkage.
Yeah, this was the U.S.'s strategy when they realized that they weren't actually going to be able to implement all of this privatization, is they were we're going to be doing the doctrine of shrinkage, the shrinkage doctrine.
Yeah, their plan was, if we eliminate the subsidies on the raw materials, on the power, if we eliminate the tariffs on imports, the bad companies will just naturally wither away and fail. and the viable ones will survive. The imports would make new private firms and new investments would flourish. And they decide that shrinkage is more practical than outright privatization in remaking the Iraqi economy.
The invisible hand has put on construction gloves. We'll be rebuilding the country.
Yeah, this McPherson guy literally thought that the looting was a form of much needed shrinkage. Like, the looting is a form of the invisible hand at play.
Ooh, sort of a Reagan fan in the Starve the Beast model, you know? So just getting back to our chronology here, we're in about the summer of 2003. And one of the major events that's mentioned in every source, from Riverbend to Imperial Life in the Emerald City, is the bombing of the UN headquarters on August 19th of 2003. The way that Americans speak about this typically is like we talked about COVID in the early days. You know, we're only 2 weeks away from getting this all sorted out, right? Paul Bremer, everyone's always saying, like, I could see the light around the corner, starting to feel better. They're saying that in 2003. And this is really a moment where people, I think, are starting to think this could get so much worse because a suicide truck drives up below the office of the UN Special Representative for Iraq, Sergio de Mello from Brazil, and destroys the UN building, killing Sergio de Mello and killing 22 other people as well. And this is a devastating event for everybody. Paul Bremer cries in public because the UN is one of the few organizations keeping things together at this point. And afterwards, the UN can't provide security for people. Like, most of the staff leave shortly after. Bremer claims it's only 1/3. I've seen in other sources that it's more. But yeah, if you don't have a place for people to work and sleep and keep safe, like, the UN's like, we can't put people's lives at risk. And they're some of the few people that you can go to for basic services, even before the United States invaded during the sanctions period. And so Riverbend writes about this. This is the girl that has the blog, Baghdad is Burning. I'm so angry and frustrated. Nothing is moving forward. There is no progress. The media is claiming Al-Qaeda. Goddamn, we never had Al-Qaeda before this occupation. Fundamentalists kept their heads down. The Ministry of Oil is being guarded 24/7 by tanks and troops. It's been guarded ever since the fall of Baghdad. Why couldn't they have put a tank in front of the UN building? Why? America, as an occupying power, is responsible for the safety and security of what's left of this country. They are responsible for the safety and security of any international humanitarian organizations inside of the country to help the people. Rightly saying, how come they can protect the Ministry of Oil, but they can't protect the UN?
Yep. She says with a certain resigned fatalism, oh, I heard Paul Bremer cried when he heard about it. I don't know why he cried. It's not his tragedy. It's Iraq's.
Yeah, Sergio de Mello is like one of the few people that Iraqis seem to have fondness for, and he is crushed in the rubble from the explosion. He's trapped between bricks, and so he's like alive, but slowly gets crushed to death as they try to dig him out. And then the same thing would happen to the Red Cross organization shortly after. In September, one of 3 women on the governing council is also shot and killed, the one that was arguing for secular government the strongest. And shortly before that,
a Shia cleric and rival of al-Sadr, who was a brother of al-Hakim on the governing council,
I believe, was also killed, many people believe, by Muqtada al-Sadr.
Yeah.
So things are starting to spiral. The Al Rashid Hotel in the Green Zone, it is attacked in October of 2003. It's attacked by mortars, and a bunch of CPA folks and staffers are injured. There are horrifying accounts of what it's like for the building you live in to be hit by a rocket. A funny story from this, or a morbid story rather, is apparently the Brits had set up their trailers in a parking garage and were sort of upset the Americans got to stay at the hotel until these mortar attacks started happening. And they started to feel a lot better about being in a fortified parking garage.
So once the attacks on the Green Zone start, it pokes a hole in everyone's delusional bubble. Every dream that the CPA had about the economy or politics or education or whatever, it hinges on security. And now you can't even protect your own little enclave from which you are governing this occupied country.
Yeah, notably only a couple miles from Sadr City.
And so it's fall 2003. The governing council is starting to actually get a little bit pushy. We need to get our sovereignty. When are we going to get the power? And Bremer desperately wants an appointed or selected council to draft the Iraqi constitution and then have the Iraqis vote on it, because he wants to keep his hand on the wheel. if you have a democratic election and then they draft the Constitution, you don't know how that election's going to wind up. And now, at this point, as things start to spiral, we start to get a lot of disunity at the top and a lot of unhappiness with Bremer. So Rice, Bush, Powell, and crew, they found a new working group called the Iraq Stabilization Group that's there to lean on Bremer to speed up the handover because they do not want to be dealing with Iraq during an election year. Listener, think about all of the problems we've identified. Now they're like, we want it solved faster. We want to be done with this. Bremer had a 7-phase plan for the handover. Step 1, form governing council. Check. Step 2, form a preparatory committee to determine how a constitution should be written. Check. Step 3, governing council assumes more day-to-day governing tasks. Partial check. Step 4, writing the Constitution. Stalled. And then, ratification election, and finally dissolve the CPA. And so even at this point, the Defense Department is still beating the drum for just expand the governing council, give the Iraqis an interim constitution, get the fuck out of Dodge. And Bremer pumps the brakes on that, at least. But his stupid 7-phase plan is dead. The plan ain't gonna work. The Iraqis want to elect the people who will draft their constitution pretty reasonably. Bremer fights and finagles for all sorts of alternatives, including appointments and caucuses. He eventually strong-arms the council into a compromise position with local caucuses to generate the people who will draft the constitution. He makes a big press conference about it, but literally days later, al-Sistani kills the plan because a caucus can be manipulated by local leaders. And I know I just spouted a bunch of boring-ass parliamentarian shit at you, but here's the point. After all of this wrangling about how to hand over power to the Iraqis, do you know what the eventual solution is, listener? This is what it all hinges on. If you want to get out, you got to find a way to give power to the Iraqis. But the Americans want to do it on terms that they can control. And their eventual solution is the fucking UN. The people that the Bush administration had nothing but contempt for in the lead up to this war. They send this Algerian guy who's just going to appoint Iraq's interim government. In the words of Rajiv, it's the equivalent of a smoke-filled room. And after all that talking about how the Iraqis are going to choose their next government and constitution and interim government, not even the governing council, with whom America had been working for so long, is going to get appointed by the UN. Great job. Mission truly accomplished. Nothing you've done in the past 6 months of occupation has led to the outcome you wanted. You just punt to the UN in the end. All those dreams about freedom and the Iraqis choosing their own path forward, fuck it. The UN's going to choose your interim government. And now everything gets accelerated. There's this November 15th agreement that Iraq would get its sovereignty by June of 2004 under this plan.
One reason why I think Paul Bremer and the United States was having such a hard time handing over constitutional power was because they had certain irreconcilable differences between what they wanted for Iraq and what was going to happen if they passed it over to the governing council as it currently existed. The United States was very insistent that there should be no religious foundation to the Constitution, right? That it shouldn't be explicitly referencing Sharia law as a basis for a legal code, for example. Or it also required a certain amount of federalism that was going to be very difficult to get the Kurds to sign up for. And so that's why this is taking so long.
January 2004, the Iraqis who were appointed by the UN draft up an interim constitution called the TAL, the Transitional Administrative Law. And it's at this point that Bremer finally learns to take a backseat and let Iraqis handle stuff. So the Bush administration didn't want an ethnic federalism. They wanted a secular blind federalism where each little governorate of Iraq would have a government. But Bremer realizes that if the Kurds want to buy in, they need to keep their autonomous zone. And he actually fights the Bush administration on this, and he's shuttling back and forth between Kurdistan and Baghdad, and he does something right. The book calls it his finest hour in Iraq. He's finally learned a little bit about the power blocks.
He basically gets the Kurds to agree to fiscal and military federalism. The central government should handle the currency, for example. He's not bad when he's dealing with people one-on-one. He has a number of meetings with al-Sistani where he can level with the guy one-on-one. But unfortunately, it's just not a very scalable thing for Paul Bremer to take on.
And it's way too little, way too late at this point.
getting back to like, hey, what does the average Iraqi think of these? And like, I think that they're largely rolling their eyes at the idea of a constitution, because you have to remember that the Americans are super insistent about the nature and language of this constitution, right? So getting something like, no one may be unlawfully arrested or detained, and no one may be detained by reason of political or religious beliefs. And this is what the Americans are so insistent goes in the Constitution, stuff like that. This is happening while American troops continue to do raids and arbitrary detentions. Riverbend is writing about this. Like, is the transitional law binding only to Iraqis? Right? I can't remember who, but they're talking about warrants, needing a warrant to arrest someone or to wiretap them. And the United States is trying to get that in the Constitution, but they're also pushing back because they don't want to deal with any of these civil rights themselves, right? These are for you. These are not for us.
Yeah.
And so it's this glaring contradiction in the thing that you're trying to get the governing council to do is not anything you're interested in yourself.
Yeah, it's like when they wrote Japan's constitution and they said the Japanese military can't leave Japan's borders. It's like, can we get that for the U.S. military? Yep, so finally, June 28th, we finally have the handover of sovereignty. It is a secret 5-minute ceremony. Paul Bremer hands over an envelope, and the Iraqis are on their own. So that's the end of our history lesson, but let's just take a little retrospective. What was the final state of Iraq after the CPA was dissolved? Bremer talks about his wins. He made a little speech, and here's what he says. Nearly 2,500 schools have been repaired. 3 million children have been immunized. Billions of dollars have been spent on reconstruction. More on this later. 8 million new textbooks have been printed. New banknotes have been rolled out without Saddam's face on it.
Doug Feith win.
We've got local councils formed, and the most expansive Bill of Rights in the Arab world was in the interim constitution. Here's what Iraqis saw at the end of the dissolution of the CPA. They were promised 6,000 megawatts of power, and they were sitting at 4, resulting in only 9 hours of electricity per day in Baghdad. 15,000 Iraqis had been hired to work on reconstruction projects instead of the 250,000 promised. 70% of police officers had received 0 training from the CPA.
The New York City commissioner that came in here said he needed 61,000 police officers to have a comparable level of police to New York City. They have, I believe, a third of that and can only train 15,000 a year if they prioritize it. Like, if they prioritize the buildings that are still intact to police training grounds, they're 6 years away from having enough police officers. That's what we're talking about here. And it just led to us deputizing en masse, quote unquote, police officers to just get as many bodies as possible.
Yep. When the CPA is dissolved, there are more than 40 attacks on American forces and foreign civilians per day on average. There are daily assassinations of political leaders and sabotage of oil and electricity infrastructure. Only 2% of the $18.4 billion supplemental that Congress passed had been spent. Nothing had been spent on construction, healthcare, sanitation, or clean water. More money had been devoted to administration, aka graft, than all projects related to education, human rights, democracy, and governance combined. But the CPA did manage to dole out almost all of the $20 billion development fund that was funded by Iraq's own oil sales, more than $1.6 billion of which went to Halliburton.
The U.S. officials, it's crazy how optimistic they were about this whole operation being funded by Iraq's oil sales, despite the fact that it hinges on Iraq having 4,000 miles of unprotected pipelines.
Christ.
So what does this all look like in practice for the average Iraqi living under the occupation? And Riverbend is a great source here because she makes clear all of the negative aspects of living under American occupation. The daily ritual humiliations and arbitrariness without any kind of recourse that happen to you every single day. And we'll start with electricity because it's so important. People forget how important electricity is.
So fucking true, dude.
Americans destroyed Iraq's electricity grid and didn't get it back up. People in Iraq are literally sleeping on the roof at night because it's so hot. On August 4th of 2003, it is the 58th straight day with the temperature over 100 degrees by 9 a.m., and the electricity is still not back up to pre-invasion levels. Riverbend discusses this at length. You know, being up at night because it's 100 degrees in your house, you're trying to sleep. If you've ever tried to sleep in a hot room, you know that it's impossible. And so she can't sleep every single night because it's so fucking hot.
And you have no fan.
Yeah, we're not talking about air conditioning. We're talking about a fan. Trying to get a fan to run, right, is impossible because you get half an hour of electricity at a time. And she mentions that everybody has insomnia, basically, in Baghdad because nobody can sleep at night. Like I said, it's 120 degrees during the summer. And this is when disillusionment with the American effort is happening in the summer because nobody can sleep at night because it's so fucking hot.
It reminds me of Do the Right Thing, which culminates in a riot and the death. And that's a film where it's constantly so hot. And when it's so hot, people get on edge. Their tempers get fiery. Close readers of Shakespeare will note that this also is the case in Romeo and Juliet. It's one of the only Shakespeare tragedies where he talks a lot about the weather, talks about how hot it is. And of course, Camus, right? The Stranger. It's so hot on that beach. And much like the war in Iraq, it ends with killing an Arab, or in this case, many Arabs.
That's what the heat will do to you.
Yeah.
I want to tell this little story about Iraq prior to the Gulf War, what their electricity grid looked like. It was one of the finest in the Arab world. They had turbines built on one of the rivers. And I was thinking to myself, like, where does this turbine come from? How do you get a turbine? Apparently, it was produced by General Electric, owners of the sitcom 30 Rock, due to the way that capital accumulation works in capitalism. But so General Electric builds these turbines for Iraq and it like electrifies the country. But we destroy these turbines in the Gulf War, just completely fucked them up. And then we put the sanctions in there, and now they can't be repaired because you can't get any of the items to repair the turbines. And so they're held together by duct tape in the interim until the invasion when they're destroyed again.
And Giordano is not saying duct tape as a metaphor. He's being quite literal. They use duct tape to hold their power grid together.
Yeah. And I think this is like a really interesting thematic point to make here about these GE turbines, because I find that when you go to a lot of national museums in other countries, you find that the American influence can be very modernizing. You go to like the National Museum in Colombia and you see these currency machines from the 19th century that were created in America, and it has this modernizing effect on the world. And for all of the things that we were doing in Iraq with Halliburton and Blackwater, General Electric made these machines in the 80s. Like, can they not just make a new turbine for Iraq?
But it takes money. The chapter on electricity is brutal because these CPA guys realize that, electricity should be the number one priority. First off, they make some classic CPA bumbling decisions where Saddam made sure that Baghdad had power no matter what, because that was his power base, even at the expense of other areas where his enemies were living anyways, you know? So the Shia areas of the south were constantly neglected because they didn't support Saddam, so Saddam puts all the power in Baghdad. The American authorities say, no, we're going to distribute electricity equally across the country. Let freedom reign. Well, now, because they only have so many megawatts of power, people only get like 3 or 6 hours of electricity a day, whatever it is. And so the Americans come up with a plan, and they actually do make some of the repairs that were needed just to keep the thing running, but they can't do the top to bottom refurbishing that they need to actually get it up to pre-war levels, because it's going to take literally tens of billions of dollars that the Americans just don't want to pay because they are neoconservatives. They don't want to put the money into the thing.
To this day, we are still not at pre-Gulf War levels of electricity generation in Iraq. I read this other Iraqi blog called Iraq the Model because I wanted to get like a different perspective. This was a dentist in Iraq who was very pro-American, actually. Like, he called it Iraq the Model because he believed that this new democratic Iraq would serve as a model for the rest of the Middle East, hence the name. And so this is a guy who really believes in the project. He believes that Paul Bremer should be named president.
Of Iraq or America?
Of Iraq.
Jesus.
Yeah. He's so excited the night before George Bush is meant to visit Iraq that he can't sleep. He advocates for the US being the one world government early on in his blog. Like, this guy believes in the mission. And reading his blog is almost more tragic because like you get to see his disillusionment happen in real time. He's forced to make excuses It's like the QAnon people with Trump or something. Like you just slowly see him grasping for why is this not working? You know, it's like it's heartbreaking to see he's trying to get his friends and coworkers to show up to anti-terrorism rallies and like nobody will go with him. But by the summer, he's openly saying, why can't they get the electricity back on? In the summer blackout of 2003 in the United States, that got a rapid response from the US government. How come they can't fix our electricity? It's tragic to see this absolute America stan lose faith in real time because he can't come up with a reason why the electricity shouldn't be back by now.
No. We're not here to put money into Iraq. We're here to take money out of Iraq. We're here to try and privatize all of your state-owned industries.
Mm-hmm.
Part of living under a military occupation is that you get more and more familiarity with casual violence. So Riverbend describes starting to be able to recognize different noises made by different kind of weapons and the effect that that realization has on you. So I'm quoting her again. I can tell you if it's a pistol or a machine gun, tank or armored vehicle, Apache or Chinook. I can determine the distance and maybe even the target. That's my new talent. It's something I've gotten so good at, I frighten myself. What's worse is that almost everyone seems to have acquired this new talent, young and old, and it's not something that anyone will appreciate on a resume. She's kind of funny, Riverbend, too.
She is. There is this like gallows humor that's present in the entire blog. There's a moment, I believe, in late 2003 where they're celebrating Ramadan as a large family, and her uncle drives back her grandparents and doesn't come back, and they're worried about him, and they drive to the grandparents and he's not there either, and they sit there for days until they get word that ransomers have kidnapped him and they're asking for $15,000 or they're going to kill him, which is an incredibly common occurrence in Iraq at this point. She's been writing about it happening to other people, but never her family. And the family scrapes together all of their savings and they pay the ransomers because, you know, what are you going to do? Like, this was all the money that they had hoped to reinvest with, but they need them back. And so they pay the ransomers, nothing happens. But then 2 days later, their uncle is returned. You know, he's been beaten because they've been interrogating him on how much money the family has. And even he has like a gallows humor at this point where he was like, yeah, originally they were going to ask for 5, but I said, hey, don't insult me. You know, you got to ask for more than that.
Hell yeah.
But just getting back to this idea of familiarity with casual violence, she says they don't sleep in their pajamas anymore because if the Americans do a raid, you don't want to be embarrassed in front of the neighborhood by being in your pajamas. Or she says that many female members of her family sleep in their jewelry because if the Americans do a nighttime raid and make you go in the street, you don't want to leave your most valuable possessions in your house because the dinar has been so devalued that most people have put their money into gold.
So you're telling me I can buy some dinars and then the value will go up.
Yeah, some nice little overlap here with the Iraqi dinar bit from Chapo. She mentions that Iraqi National Day on April 9th, she's really not looking forward to this day because she knows that there's going to be a bunch of anti-state violence. And of course there is, right? Because people disagree with the notion that this should mean anything, Iraqi National Day, and there's a bunch of attacks. And she's scared. And it's like, yeah, imagine if the 4th of July you were like, oh, I know there's going to be anti-state actors that do roadside bombs, and it just makes it a very bad day. She talks about how difficult it is for her to visit her aunt, who's north of the city, constant carjackings. She's familiar enough to know that there's now like an orthodoxy around what you should do when your car gets hijacked, which is to not fight them. Everything takes twice as long because the roads have been destroyed, and the entire time you're worried about being killed or kidnapped.
Yeah, and there's also just smaller scale daily humiliation. So even when it's not a fear for your life moment, interacting with these occupying forces is just awful. Quoting her again, she says, I hated them on June 3rd when our cars were pulled over for some strange reason in the middle of Baghdad, and we, 3 women, a man, and a child, were made to get out and stand in a row while our handbags were rummaged, the men were frisked, and the car was thoroughly checked by angry, brisk soldiers. I don't think I'll ever be able to put into words the humiliation of being searched.
Yeah, she uses the word humiliation a lot when talking about the nature of the occupying U.S. soldiers. You know, she talks about how like a lot of women keep a Quran in their purse and like the dogs are sniffing in these purses. And something I didn't know as an American is like, this is not okay. You can't have a dog near a Quran. She's talking about how like you're meant to like wash your hands before you even open your Quran. And these soldiers are allowing a dog to root around in it. And in some cases throwing the book on the floor while they're searching through women's purses.
Mm-hmm.
There's a story here that she mentions in her blog that I didn't know about, which was the U.S. bulldozed an entire orchard as a form of collective punishment.
Jesus.
And yeah, just daily humiliations from the American government.
Yeah. There's a story I remember that's kind of connected to the Japanese occupation where when the Sony Electronics company was trying to come up with a name, in like the 50s or 60s or whenever it was started. They settled on Sony because for Western audiences, it didn't sound too Japanese, and it kind of looked like the word for sound in a lot of Western languages because it comes from the Latin word sonus. But for Japanese audiences, a lot of people had weirdly fond memories of interactions with American GIs during the occupation, or at least the founder of Sony did, because the soldiers would hand out chocolate bars and they would call Japanese children Sonny, Sonny, in their like 1940s or 50s slang. Here's a chocolate and some cigarettes, Sonny. And it's just a story that stuck in my mind that is a big contrast between the attitudes of American soldiers in different occupations and wars. All right, so let's move on to our themes and big ideas for this period of the Iraq War. And the first theme I would like to discuss is just the absolutely delusional life in the Green Zone. So that book is called Imperial Life in the Emerald City, Wizard of Oz, right? He calls it Versailles on the Euphrates, and that really is the vibe. Except, unfortunately, we never got guillotines. People there were able to live in this state of complete denial about what was going on in Iraq. They barely left as they were doing all the shit we just described. This 7-square-mile enclave of Baghdad had a pool, it had electricity and running water 24/7, it had bars and restaurants, including famously the Green Zone Burger King. It had laundry services and a fucking car wash as they drove their Suburbans around. It had a cafeteria where the menu looks like a goddamn cheesecake factory. Rajiv says you could eat in the cafeteria for 6 months without ever eating any Iraqi food. They serve grits, cornbread, all kinds of pork, bacon cheeseburgers, grilled cheese and bacon sandwiches, bacon omelets. It's so regulated from the military and their contractors, everything down to the temperature that they boiled the hot dogs at.
In water, by the way, that had to be shipped in from Kuwait. Like even the water to boil the hot dogs was water from Kuwait. None of this stuff could be sourced locally for fear of contamination by, the evil people that are in this country. And so all of the water comes from bottles flown in from Kuwait.
Yeah, because Baghdad still doesn't have clean drinking water. They still haven't repaired the sewer system.
Rajiv points out, this land that produces the world's best cucumbers, would it have killed them to serve a Iraqi cucumber salad? To have sourced any of these things from the country they were occupying? But it's no, the food here has to be the same as it is in Arkansas.
It was a morale thing. It has to be like Little America. They have a legion of Pakistani and Indian, basically indentured servants that were hired by Halliburton to wait on them.
This feeds into the larger theme that is mentioned also by Riverbend, which is this idea that we're going to rebuild Iraq, but we're not going to use any Iraqis to do it. Right? Because we're going to put it onto the global market and we're going to hire the lowest bidder for services procurement. So she talks about her uncle, who is an unemployed engineer. Over the last 17 years, her uncle has worked on replacing 20 of the 133 bridges damaged during the Gulf War. He has all this time on his hands and he puts together an estimate for how much it would cost to replace the new Diyala Bridge that they're talking about in this post. And he has an estimate of $300,000. This is a guy who's been doing this in Iraq for 17 years, has repaired 20 bridges in Baghdad. And she says, okay, let's pretend that my uncle's a moron, which he isn't, but let's pretend he is. And it's actually 4 times higher. It's $1.2 million. She says the American company that has just been given the contract to rebuild the bridge is being allotted $50 million.
Christ.
Right. So it's not only are they not employing Iraqis in a country with 65% unemployment to do any of this stuff, but also just all of this slush for Halliburton. Right, for being able to upcharge. And we didn't have enough time on this episode, but we'd really like to dedicate a full episode to military contractors in the future because they're such a huge part of the story and we just don't have time today. But there's so many scams going on with the people who are taking up these contracts. I think Blowback mentioned that in this world where you want to do all this military intervention, but you don't have the political will to actually get people on the ground to do it, with a draft like you would in Korea or Vietnam, you make this up with money by just hiring military contractors. And the United States is getting fleeced over and over and over again with this, but we'll talk about this another time. I'd love to do a War Dogs review and talk about this.
And you know that these same people would say that we can't get the water and electricity running in Iraq because of Iraqi corruption, right? You just know that that would be an excuse. They would talk about Iraqi corruption and graft, and meanwhile, this is how they're running it. But yeah, in the green zone, which as a reminder, is centered around Saddam's palace and a few blocks around it. There's Saddam's palace, there's a hotel, there's some parking garages. You have this surreal image of the ornate Saddam palace. But then you have almost the feel of like a US startup. There's cables and Dell computers that are slapdash thrown together in it, but also the regulations of a DC government building. So everyone has a lanyard as they're living in Saddam's former palace running this occupation. And it becomes Baghdad's little America, where, quoting Rajiv again, the sub-Saharan privation and Wild West lawlessness that gripped one of the world's most ancient cities swirled around the walls. But on the inside, the calm sterility of an American subdivision prevailed. It's like a fort on the American frontier, except instead of advancing American rugged individualism, it's advancing the Cheesecake Factory is what is bringing there. What all this means is that the people running the occupation can delude themselves. They can live in complete denial of how well it's going out there.
There's this great story in the Emerald City about an enterprising Iraqi guy who opens up a pizza shop right outside the green zone, thinking like, oh, this will be great business. You know, I'll make pizza and sell it to people in the green zone. What he doesn't realize is that no one is going to ever leave the green zone. And so in addition to problems caused by having a pizza oven in a country without electricity.
Well, it's wood fired. He's good there.
It's also like 120 degrees inside. But even as far as like getting people to order pizza outside, he's shocked at how few people leave the green zone.
And yeah, all sorts of funny quotes from these people where they just got their head in the sand. They're these idealistic neocons who are there to reshape the world. There's one guy who Rajiv asks about this devastating car bomb attack on a Shia shrine. And the guy responds, yeah, I saw something about that on the office television, but I didn't watch the full report. I was too busy working on my democracy project. It's like, bro, the Shia shrine car bomb is why your democracy project ain't gonna fucking work, dude.
Right. Yeah, I guess we skipped over those events, but maybe we can get to that in the insurgency part. But yeah, there's a number of attacks on Shia shrines hoping to incite a civil war.
Yeah.
Okay, so our second theme here, this theme is titled They Learnt It From Us, aka Civilian Infrastructure Destruction. And so I just think reading through all these books, it was really upsetting because all of these US officials like Bremer are appalled at the fact that these terrorists, the people who are fighting the Americans, are attacking civilian infrastructure. They're attacking the oil pipelines. They're attacking the electricity generators. They're attacking the water system for people. And they're appalled. They're like, who would do this? Who would target civilian infrastructure? It was so upsetting to me because this is exactly what America was targeting when they were trying to get rid of Saddam. When they were trying to exert pressure on Saddam, they were trying to delegitimize the state by denying its ability to provide civil services, like electricity and water. And so as shocked and as appalled as Paul Bremer and Donald Rumsfeld can be that the terrorists are resorting to such barbaric practices as targeting civilian infrastructure, the whole time you're going, they learned it from you. You started this. Do you not see the inherent irony in your government having the exact same tactics as these terrorists who you could never understand? You are both doing the same thing. Destroying services that make everyday lives better for people.
Or possible.
Possible, yeah.
Virtually every decision that the CPA makes guarantees they won't be able to address services. Like we saw, firing every Baathist. Make sure you won't be able to get the services on. But even some of the free market shit. They remove import tariffs and they flood Iraq with foreign cars. And some Iraqis had stashed some money under their mattresses. And now there's all these extra cars on the road. So there's traffic and there's gasoline shortages because you just added all these fucking cars. Every single decision they make sure that they cannot address the issues of security and services.
I can just imagine one of these guys saying, what kind of animals target civilian infrastructure? Who goes around destroying their own neighborhood? You know, and it's like, oh yeah? What kind of animals would do that, huh? You know?
May I remind you of 6 months ago in the doctrine of shock and awe. Our third major idea is incompetence, right? What the occupation needed was experts, and what they got were mostly GOP operatives. If you wanted to go to Baghdad, it was a great political stepping stone for the next step in your career if you were a GOP person. There are so many passages in the Emerald City book about what traits in a person were considered qualifying and what were considered disqualifying for getting a job at the CPA. Qualifying. Did you vote for President Bush in 2000? Because there is a loophole in military hiring that lets you ask questions that would get you hauled into court in civilian life. So you could just ask them who they voted for. Do you share the neoconservatives' utopian views around both political and economic freedom? Are you a relative of a donor or member of the Heritage Foundation? Are you extremely young and inexperienced? This is good because it means you're more likely to hang around longer in Baghdad than the minimum. Here are some things that are disqualifying. Are you a veteran, experienced Middle East hand? You're out. This means you have your own views about the region, and you might not buy into our utopian vision of reforming it. And because the Iraq occupation was such a bureaucratic turf war between state and defense, are you more aligned with defense than state? Quoting the book, veteran Middle East hands were regarded as insufficiently committed to the goal of democratizing the region. You know, the people who know about it. Post-conflict experts, many of whom worked for the State Department, the United Nations, or non-governmental organizations, were deemed too liberal.
Yeah, that part was horrifying, where he's talking about how there are so few Democrats in the green zone because it was a condition for being hired so often that you would keep it to yourself. And it's again, they're going to be doing Republican policy in Iraq that they wouldn't allow in America.
Mm-hmm.
And they're coming from a much more centrally planned place. So of course it's going to cause immense amount of thrash.
There's a story from late 2003 about Bremer's inner circle of powerful minds. And this is just such a great emblematic example. In the green zone, there were some real veteran specialists from the State Department. There was a former ambassador to Saudi Arabia who spoke Arabic better than anyone else at state, a former ambassador to Syria and Algeria, a former ambassador to Bahrain, and the 2 Arab world experts who ran the Department of State's Iraq desk. Instead, Bremer chose as his inner circle of key advisors a 24-year-old who wrote his undergraduate thesis on Winston Churchill's anti-communist philosophy, a 34-year-old from the Brookings Institute, and a former legislative assistant to Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum, who was recommended by Liz Cheney.
Jesus.
These were the great minds running the CPA. Okay, next big theme, big idea is less incompetence and more just malice. So these are the people who were so dedicated to free markets that they were willing to absolutely torch Iraq for their dream. Consequences be damned. Because they wanted to create a free market capitalist utopia in Iraq, and they used the chaos of the war to do so. Like this McPherson guy, he rewrote Iraq's tax code, slashing the top tax rate for individuals from 45% to a flat 15%. This was the dream of the free market zealots of the states. Never mind the fact that most Iraqis didn't pay taxes. And they also take out the protectionist laws that were on the books, that any Iraqi business had to be at least 51% owned by Iraqis.
Yeah, imagine the optics on that they're coming in and saying, yep, all of your businesses are now for sale to foreigners.
Yeah, and we already kind of talked about all the free market reforms in the history lesson. But yeah, these tariffs that had a 200% import tariff on luxury goods, Americans take those down and they get a photo op of Iraqis perusing foreign products. This is a win for them. This is what freedom means to them. It's the freedom to shop. I'll also put in the malice column how they treated the Ministry of Health, where they fired the one guy with a ton of experience in global public health who was initially there for being too liberal, and they put in a guy who wanted to export American hospital administration to the Iraqis.
That's the one part of American culture everybody in the world wants. Is the way our healthcare system works.
So, yeah, you get both. You get incompetence and you get malice. Next big idea. Just the horrendous optics. And I don't want to dwell too much on this because who gives a shit when Iraqis are dying by the hundreds of thousands about optics, but so much of the American optics of this occupation just seemed to scream, we are the new Saddam Hussein regime. The green zone is quite literally in the Republican palace. It is just as fortified and apart as Saddam's inner circle was. But also it's somehow worse because we hate your culture. at least Saddam was Iraqi. And, you have this little enclave where no Iraqis are allowed to work. And as you read all these stories, the Americans are obsessed with optics. Let's get the photos of the Iraqis voting. Let's get the photos of the Iraqis shopping. Let's get all kinds of photo ops. But they seem to fail to recognize that how could the Iraqis view this occupation as anything less than the looting of their country?
Mm-hmm. This is our next theme here, which is about the freaking news. Cue the newsroom theme song. This is one of my favorite sections of almost every source we read, was whenever it alluded to like the media environment in Iraq at this point. And it's so funny because it is truly the Bush administration getting hoisted by its own petard here. In the lead up to the war, they benefited immensely from the mantra of if it bleeds, it leads, right? It's good for these media companies for us to go to war because people will watch the news more. And so it's this thing that's propelling the Bush administration towards their goals. But as soon as we enter the occupation phase, they find that the if it bleeds, it leads mantra, they don't like anymore. No, that's no good. You got to get rid of how about this as a headline? New school opens in Iraq. The Bush administration and Paul Bremer are repeatedly angry that the news is not painting as rosy of a picture as they would like as this insurgency is building steam and as the UN building is being bombed. And so Bremer literally several times says, hey, how about you do a story on the number of schools we've repaired instead of one of the 3 women on the governing council being assassinated. And then there's this great story too in the Emerald City about the army actually hires a military contractor to like provide news coverage in Iraq, which is a smart idea, I suppose, but they provide so few resources to these people that it's just like hilarious them trying to start a news station with a tin can and a ring light, basically.
Yep. They try and found an Iraqi national broadcaster. Because Al Jazeera is opposed to the Iraq War and opposed to the Americans. These pan-Arab stations that the Iraqis can finally get now that Saddam is gone aren't towing the American line. And so it's the same formula that we've seen. Not enough money, not enough staff, not enough security for it to be successful. And then you have the compounded fact that they have one, guy who knows his shit, who's worked in the Middle East and worked in media, and they want to start the news with a prayer from the Quran, which is standard in the Middle East. And Paul Bremer says absolutely not and tries to cut it. And he totally undercuts this media, which is immediately seen, rightfully by the Iraqis, as American propaganda. And so they don't watch it. It's a stillborn news channel. I thought you were trying to make a free press happen. Wasn't that the whole thing behind this war, was nation building? Especially now that they didn't find weapons of mass destruction.
And interestingly, after the United States invades, because Saddam, had a complete chokehold on the news, there are like hundreds of Iraqi newspapers that start up overnight. And there's a couple funny like Riverbend posts where she reads through these newspapers that you see. And often they end up just being used to like protect your floors when you're eating dinner and stuff like that. But there's new weekly world news in Iraq, that have these insane conspiracy theories that she'll write about, knowing that they're conspiracies, obviously.
Yeah, and I mean, significantly, Muqtada al-Sadr founds a newspaper, and our freedom-loving, nation-building neoconservatives shutter his fucking paper when he publishes a story with the headline, Bremer follows in Saddam's footsteps. Nope, not that. We're shuttering it. We're closing the damn news.
Yeah, Viceroy follows in dictator's footsteps. As soon as the news is not rosy, they're very annoyed at the idea of the free press. And Iraqis rightfully see this American operation, and all of them start watching Al Jazeera, which is covering this war very intensely for other Arab countries and covering some of the horrifying things that are going on, often at the behest of the American forces. And Al Jazeera and Al Arabia are eventually suspended for 2 weeks because the CPA, they come out and say there's a list of things that you're not allowed to discuss, the number of casualties and the number of attacks on the coalition. And so Riverbend says, oh, okay, it's only freedom of the press when you have good things to say. Well, Iraqis know all about that. The irony of these neoconservative idealism running into the wall of reality one more time, in one more setting of the media.
Yep. All right, our next big theme, America makes proto-ISIS, or fundamentalism in a power vacuum.
This part was particularly heartbreaking to read about. So Riverbend, like I said, is a young woman in Iraq, and she mentions that under Saddam's secular government, 50% of all college graduates are women. 50% of the workforce is women. And this is just no longer the case after the war. Because there's a power vacuum and we've essentially made the Ba'ath Party illegal, the people who are still standing are like the religious authorities in the country, right? The Shia clerics from the south of Iraq, people like al-Sistani. And immediately life becomes so much harder for her. I mentioned up top that not only does she lose her job because now it's not appropriate for a woman to hold a position like this, but she can't even leave her house to go to the grocery store anymore without male accompaniment. And she says a lot of times religious authorities will place guards around schools to ensure that women can't attend them. For Riverbend specifically, it has a ton of negative effects on her life and the state of feminism in Iraq. And you see this in the Middle East quite often. The British did this in Palestine, where they essentially made the secular authority of Palestine illegal. And as a result, the only thing that's left is a religious authority.
Yeah, and then you have the fact that it's not just people stepping into a power vacuum. The Americans quite explicitly support this.
Right.
So there was an organization called the Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolution in Iraq that was founded in 1982 in Tehran. This organization's goal is to export the Iranian Revolution to Iraq so it'll have the same style of theocratic rule. Obviously, huge enemies of Saddam Hussein, so the Americans assume that they're allies. And so they come back to Iraq after the fall of Saddam and start swinging their weight around. And America quite literally puts these Shiite Islamists in positions of authority. So there's Abdul Aziz al-Hakim is the deputy leader of Skiri, and he had a turn ruling Iraq as part of the governing council. And Riverbend says that this man was responsible for torturing and executing Iraqi POWs in Iran throughout the Iran-Iraq war.
She calls them scary. But yeah, sort of the United States doing the enemy of my enemy is my friend adage in this chapter as well, being like, okay, Saddam is my enemy. His enemy is scary. So they're my friend. Who are they again? Oh, the Iranians. Like, we've gone full circle in this America trying to do 4D chess in the region.
Yep.
And so Riverbend writes like about this situation. She wants desperately just to like go outside and like go to the grocery store again without having to bug a male member of her family. And she's quoting another blogger in a section, but I'll read this section here, which is her trying to comprehend what's happened to her life since the invasion. And it's, so the response of the Bush administration to the September 11th attack on the United States by a group of radical Islamist extremists has been to abolish secular law for Iraqi women and impose a fundamentalist reading of Islamic law on them. Yes, this all makes perfect sense. There are some irresolvable issues here. And like, I don't know what to suggest because the United States comes in and they look for a source of legitimacy and they see the Shia religious authority in Iraq and they hand power over to them. And I think this is a Futurama joke, but if the United States were to like put all of the requirements that they're looking for in a leader in Iraq, it's like, okay, we need a secular leader who acts as a bulwark against Iran, who won't be able to punish minority groups. And I think like the algorithm would spit out Saddam Hussein with an autonomous Kurdish zone. The thing that they actually want is to have Saddam back with provisions to protect the Kurds, basically.
Sometimes you don't know how good you have it until it's already gone.
And our last little section here, finally, is resolve. We came in with the coalition of the willing, and we're seeing over this 6-month period as the summer months get hotter and longer. Like I said, Rumsfeld is now bored of this. The White House is not interested in Iraq. They want to get over this, right? This is boring, you know. Is this still going? Well, you guys are still there. Can't you finish this up already? Other countries like Spain, are rightfully seeing this quagmire developing and going, oh, well, we're also bored and we can just leave. We don't have to stick around. Like the United States, it'll look embarrassing for them, but like, it's not going to look embarrassing if Spain leaves. And so we're increasingly getting our coalition being less interested in this entire mission. And Paul Bremer is spitting fire when he calls them the coalition of the unwilling during this period. At this point, the CPA asks Spain to arrest al-Sadr. And Spain goes, no, thank you. We're not getting involved in that. George Bush liked to parade around the fact that they had this giant coalition, but this coalition has very much lost interest at this point, and it is just the United States, who are basically the only people who can't leave without embarrassing themselves.
Yeah, there was a United Nations resolution that signed over power to America as the occupying authority, so they are bound by international law to stick around until they hand it over.
I just want to have like a quick theme section here about dispelling some of the stereotypes about Iraq as like our last theme here. Because I feel like we never really got a great understanding in America of how Iraqis felt about any of this. But she talks about being a proud Iraqi. She says so explicitly. I was brought up, like millions of Iraqis, to have pride in my own culture and nationality. And the way that she talks about Iraqi food and rituals, like it really comes through in this blog. And she's reading news coming out of America, and she's just appalled at how people are speaking about Iraq and what they're going through right now. She's quoting a New York Times article where the headline is about how Iraqi cultural practices are making democracy impossible. And so she's reading the New York Times, and she quotes it here when it says, a key purpose of veiling, like to wear the hijab, is to prevent outsiders from competing with a woman's cousins for marriage.
Christ.
And she's reading this and going, you think that like this is the reason why democracy isn't working here. It's not the fact that planes are flying so close to our houses that it's waking everybody up at night in a country where we already don't have electricity and we're subject to daily raids. You think the fact that we have to wear veils because our like horny cousins are trying to fuck us is the reason why democracy is not working here. Like this is a fundamental lack of respect that you have for the Iraqi people. And this is such a convenient out for you to say that, you know, we're savages. That's why this isn't working.
Yeah, and it's also worth stressing, a lot of people are going to point to these irreconcilable ethnic and sectarian tensions in Iraq. But Riverbend is from a mixed Sunni Shia family. And there are a lot of Iraqi voices who say that the American presence made the ethnic tensions a million times worse. Because as they are generating their governing council, they are doing it along ethnic lines. They're saying we need 4 Shias, 3 Kurds, 3 Sunnis, or whatever it is. The Americans are obsessed with these ethnic divisions, and Saddam was a proud Iraqi nationalist. Now, it's easy for the Sunnis as the ruling minority group to say, oh, we're all Iraqis. You know, it's easy for them to say. And I don't want to overstate the case that Iraq was a nationalist utopia first. These sectarian divisions did obviously exist, but America did basically everything it could to make them worse.
Yeah.
The saddest entries from Riverbend's blog are when she's resigned in Fatalistic, where, you know, after the UN bombing, she's saying, in spite of the fact that the UN was futile in stopping this war, seeing someone like DeMello gave people some sort of weak hope. It gave you the feeling that, no, the Americans couldn't run amok in Baghdad without the watchful eye of the international community. Somehow I'm terrified. If someone like DeMello couldn't or simply wasn't protected, what's going to happen to the millions of people needing protection in Iraq? How could this have been allowed to happen? Yeah, just heartbreaking to read. She's so well informed on everything that's going down. I'm willing to bet if you asked your average American on the street in 2003-4 about the state of the Iraqi occupation, would they know about the governing council? Would they know about the rotating presidency? Would they know about the debates between an appointed constitutional council or an elected constitutional council? Fuck no. They would know jack shit.
I'd be shocked if they at least knew that Saddam Hussein didn't do 9/11. Like, that's my baseline for, like, the average person's familiarity with this conflict.
Yeah. She's so astute and well-informed, and it's an important perspective to get. That's why we tried to use it. Okay, so here's our little film review of The Green Zone, a film ostensibly adapting Imperial Life in the Emerald City, but actually not at all that. The film tells the story of Matt Damon's Miller. I don't know his first name. And he's a soldier who's looking for weapons of mass destruction. And he quickly comes to realize that there aren't any, and there's something else afoot.
He can't believe all the intelligence is wrong. I'm going to these sites and there's nothing there.
And if the movie has a thesis, it is the very libbed up Hollywood take that if you're going to do a war, you better not lie. You better go to war for the right reasons.
Right. If we just didn't have this damn Greg Kinnear character, if only the Cheney appointee wasn't there, then we would have been doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Because Matt Damon, in his search for the WMDs, finds an ally in the Brendan Gleeson CIA figure. Brendan Gleeson not even trying to not put on his Irish accent, you know? And finding that he's being hamstrung by the civilian government who doesn't want it to get out, that the WMD allegations are all fabricated.
And in fact, they knew that there were not any, and they lied. It's all about how they lied about the WMD. It actually goes even a bit further, because like we said on part 2, they didn't know definitively that there weren't, but they knew that the intel was very, very flawed. This movie takes it one step further and says they knew definitively that there were not, and they said that there were. And there are these cringy scenes where Matt Damon is yelling at the superiors, and they're saying, why does it matter? We're here now. And he's going, it's the only thing that matters. It's the reason for this war. And it's like, bro, it actually doesn't at this point. It does not matter at all. The movie makes the CIA into the good guy. There are a few moments that gesture towards some themes in the book. It's such a worse adaptation of journalistic nonfiction than Fast Food Inc. was, which did a brilliant job of putting all of these strands into the tapestry.
Honestly, that's a great point. If they had done the Green Zone like Fast Food Nation, where like you're telling the story of like an ordinary person coming into contact with all of these details from the book, it might have worked. But the central premise of the Green Zone as a movie, the search for WMDs and the civilian leadership's attempt to thwart him, is so divorced from what's happening in the book, right? He is, Superman, Matt Damon, right? He's a larger than life figure. And so that's a really great point that like they didn't even try to do that. There's 2 scenes that try to make references to the actual Green Zone point. Like the main thesis of this book is this is the Emerald City. This is a fantasy land. And there's basically 2 scenes where that's alluded to.
Yeah, we hear Matt Damon say, do you actually know what's going on outside the Green Zone? That's like a gesture towards like, hey, that's the title of the book.
And even then, when he's walking around the pool, right, and he's seeing all these CPA people drinking their margaritas and hanging out, I think the contrast they're trying to make is between the army and the CPA. Not even like the point of the book, which was look at the contrast between the CPA and the people of Iraq. So they're not even making the right contrast in the scene where they're gesturing to the book.
Yep. The villain of the film is an ex-general of Saddam, and he can prove to Matt Damon that the government was lying about WMDs. And Matt Damon has to chase him down. And it's a cat versus mouse because the Defense Department and the CIA are both trying to track him down. The Defense Department is trying to track him down to kill him and silence him and make sure the truth doesn't get out. The CIA is trying to track him down to make this ex-Saddam leader the new autocratic ruler of Iraq. And we're meant to root for Matt Damon and the CIA. Because the movie knows what's going to happen. There's these obnoxious winking lines where people are asking like, do you want a civil war? This general's the only guy who can stop a civil war or whatever.
Yeah, we should mention he's the ostensible villain. Like the twist at the end, and this is something the Green Zone did bring up, is that we were probably meant to offer Saddam's generals a deal, right? To like be reintegrated into life. And this movie is about how Paul Bremer's directive number 2 or whatever of disbanding the military. And so they're kind of alluding to that with this general waiting for a deal. It turns out that he's not the villain. He's actually someone that could have helped us, but the evil Greg Kinnear character stood in the way.
Yeah. Some funny media bits where there's a Judith Miller stand-in. It's a white lady journalist who works for the Wall Street Journal, who published all the cooked intelligence. But unlike the real Judith Miller, she wants to make it right. She now wants to publish the truth. And just some hilarious lived-up Hollywood lines where Matt Damon's soldier asks her, how does this happen? How does someone write something that's not true?
Yeah, that one was brutal.
In war, truth is the first casualty, Matt Damon. Yeah, it's a very boilerplate, generic action movie with some obnoxious, lived-up Hollywood politics. We're just trying to stop an insurgency, is a line that a character literally says. The action in the film is a fucking snooze fest. At the climax of the film, an Iraqi kills the general that Matt Damon was going to make a deal with and says, it is not for you to decide what happens here. I guess the final takeaway of the film is that it's bad to lie into a war. Iraqis can choose what to do. And Matt Damon tries to make it right because he has the truth and he emails it to all of the papers in America so that the truth can finally get out. He gets the real mission accomplished. This is the take of the war. He says, what do you mean? It's all that fucking matters. Why you go to war, that's all that matters. As opposed to, how you do the war, how you plan for the war, how you plan for what comes after the war. No. It's only the reason why. If you have a just cause, everything you do after is fine because you had a just cause. And the final shot of the film is some American Humvees driving by an oil refinery. Get it?
Yeah, and they change everybody's name. It's too bad. Like, there's a Chalabi figure in this movie, but I don't think he's ever actually seen on screen at any point.
He's there very briefly. We see him kiss the ground when he lands in Iraq in one of the opening scenes.
That would have been so fun to see a Chalabi-like figure. You think that's a great character. He's a hilarious character. Someone who's so universally reviled by the people of the country that is like our number one option for being the president.
Yeah, the Brendan Gleeson says something. He's like, he wouldn't get 50 votes in Baghdad. There's like a couple offhanded lines, but yeah, do not watch. It really does not appreciate how excellent the book was, what the book was trying to say. It's just a very particular late 2000s Hollywood lib take on the Iraq War, which, as I've said, is if you're going to do a war, you better not lie.
The book itself has very little to say about WMDs, which is 80% of what this movie is about.
Yep. All right. Closing thoughts.
I guess my closing thoughts are like, it's interesting at this time, like in this end of history era, that our democracy and free market as a panacea was so believable to everybody as being like, oh yeah, don't worry, like the details will work themselves out via the invisible hand. And I think given the fact that Trump is the president now, I think it would be a lot harder to invade a country with this as a solution. The idea that like, oh yeah, don't worry, you'll be able to elect a president. And it's like, well, who's your president? It's like, oh yeah, it's this guy that is ruining everything, you know?
That everyone hates.
Yeah, exactly. And so I thought that was like interesting this whole time. There's definitely been like a mindset shift in the way that we think about democracy and the free market, I hope. It would be so much harder with a straight face to be like, you should have what we have. We have this guy that we all hate.
Yeah, the story of the first year of the occupation is truly a heartbreaking one. And I think the most tragic element of it is that it's not really a missed opportunity. Like Giordano comparing it to the Kobayashi Maru is actually perfect. There's no way that you can what if your way into this being successful, because the fundamental structure of this war, going in with so few troops, going in with no plan, going in with so few people and staff and whatever, meant that there was no way this could go any other way. And in the book, there's some stories of some people who actually care a lot. There's a guy who wants to reform the Iraqi education system, particularly post-secondary education. He's this academic, and he gets the most black-pilled of anyone who's there. But there were some people who actually believed in trying to repair and restore this country after all of the devastation and all of the totalitarianism. And they were just hustled and swindled, and I believe one of them says just mugged by reality. Seeing these well-intentioned people, and there were very few of them, let me be clear. They're mostly Nepo babies and ghouls who went over and were part of the CPA. There's like a marine biology PhD who tries to start an Iraqi science center.
Yeah, he was really admirable.
Yeah, he's breaking the rules of the occupation to try and get this started. The education guy, the firefighter who's the closest they had to a labor organizer because he was involved in the firefighters union. There are a few stories of some idealistic people who just got absolutely swindled. But the biggest victims, of course, have to be the Iraqi people. And it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better for the Iraqis, having done everything they could make to ensure an insurgency followed by a civil war.
Yeah, join us 2 weeks from now for our episode on the insurgency. You know, we've mentioned throughout this episode that security has been a problem and that we're moving from a society in which the Sunni minority has had power, and now the U.S. government is very eager to give power to these Shia religious authorities, and it's going to cause a host of problems. The United States is somehow going to have an insurgency from both sides. Like, how do you fuck that up so badly? At least the British had the sense to like, let's just give it to the weaker side, you know, so they need us. The United States is going to have insurgents from both the Sunnis and Shias. Okay, so that's all we have to say. Those are closing thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us for part 3. It's been such a treat to do these episodes and really deep dive into a topic. It's really not something that Ben and I have done before. Normally, these are a little bit more fixed and discreet, and so we just put together a list of how many books we've read already, and it's already at like 14, and it's just so awesome making a podcast where you have like such a more well-rounded understanding of something, and it's so harder to tackle. It's like a lot more rewarding, actually.
Yeah, and listener, please talk to anyone you can about the Iraq War. One of the biggest struggles for me is as I read all these books and become more informed and develop better opinions and become more and more passionate about the topic, I can't share it with anyone, because if you bring up the Iraq War to most people, they say only old heads remember. You know, why are you still talking about that?
I'm so annoying now, I feel like. It's too bad, too, because like I'm reading all these books about the worst thing our country's done in recent memory. And then I'm like, okay, well, let me take a break from this and go to like, just think about the present day for, oh, crap. It's like things already are so tough to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And the fantasy world that I'm going into every day is 2003 Iraq. It's like things are hard right now. I would say that my brain is broken, but I think we only have a couple more episodes of this left.
But yeah, tell everyone you know. Donald Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, they died in their bed. But there's still a few guys we could get. There's still a few guys we could bring to a war crimes tribunal of some
True.
kind.
Yeah, that's the dream, really. There's a war crimes tribunal for some of these people.
Bush, Cheney, they're still alive.
And leave a comment. You know, like I said, it's so hard for me to talk about this stuff with my friends because they don't want to talk about the war in Iraq. And so let me talk to you about it in the comments. And, oh, sorry. One thing, that UN bombing that I mentioned earlier, if anyone knows anything more about, like, I didn't have time to look into this because there was so much to get to, but Ahmed Chalabi's nephew was in charge of security for the UN building. And he was hired to do that through, you know, one of these Panama LLCs owned by a group of lawyers in the States, one of whom was Doug Feith. So this is like Doug Feith profiting off of Ahmed Chalabi being in charge of one of the worst security breaches in Iraq. So if you know more about that, you know, if you've already looked into this, please let me know because I'm curious and I just don't have the time right now to fully figure out what was going on there.
Yeah, I think 2 more, maybe 3, but one of them might be Patreon paywalled. Oh, yes. And as always, thank you for listening. Please like, please subscribe, write a comment, do all the algorithm engagement. And we have 3 episodes up on our Patreon now. We got Snakes on a Plane, Waiting, and Troy. So check that out. If you'd love to support the show, we will give you some bonus content.
Yes, we've been blown away by the support there. That's really helped us out, especially considering now we have twice as many obligations to get things out.
A second deadline has hit the podcast.
Mr. Podcast Host, a second deadline has just hit the feed. But yeah, so anyway, thanks so much for joining us and being here for this series. And we'll get you in a couple weeks with the story of the insurgency.
Sounds good. Ciao, ciao.
Peace.